All right, everybody, we are live on the YouTubes. Welcome to another episode of The Unapologetic Apologist. I'm your host, Stelman Smith Jr. Today, with me is my guest, Plantinga's Bulldog's the YouTube channel. In the description, please go subscribe to it. Kyle Valmar, thanks for being here, brother.
Yeah, man, no problem. And I don't have any videos yet, but I'm working on it. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, awesome. Well, I'm glad you're here. We've been discussing. You posted something, I think it was a while back, different thoughts on Molinism and the whole debate going on there. And I said, hey, we should probably talk about this. And then you had the idea to do a show on it. So, really, just I guess. Well, unless you want to let's actually give a brief introduction of yourself before we kind of get right into the meat of the episode.
Yeah. So my name is Kyle. I love philosophy. It's like my lifelong hobby, philosophy and theology. And I just love thinking about things, asking questions. You ask my parents, they're always annoying because I'm always asking too many questions. But I just love thinking through things, parsing out ideas, being critical of my own ideas and other people's ideas and that type of thing. Yeah, and so that's just me. I just love thinking through all that stuff. I kind of ran across Molinism as a result of my foray into apologetics on a deeper level over the past few months. And I kind of liked it at first, but I think some of the entailments of it are things that I'm not a huge fan of. But anyhow, I just thought it was interesting to start looking into it. And I think a lot of people take the view. So anyhow, I thought it would be a fun thing to look into. So.
Awesome, yeah, and people who are familiar with the show know I've had Dr. Tim Stratton on a bunch of times. Braxton Hunter's been on the channel, so I'm a fan of Molinism. I'd call myself a Molinist. I've discussed it. People can go back if they want a kind of introduction to Molinism. They can go back and look at some of those videos. So I guess just to kind of jump right into it, for people, hopefully most people are already kind of familiar with the basic idea of it. I'm going to kind of kick it over to you to kind of explain what your thinking is on the process and what your objections are.
Yeah. So I just want to clarify some things to start. So, firstly, as far as my position, this is a debate on or discussion on divine providence, on views of divine providence. So I don't actually have a position right now. I'm not necessarily divine determinist, Molinist, simple foreknowledge, process theology, open theism. Don't really know which one of those is true, except I'm pretty sure that Molinism and I know process theology is wrong, and then Molinism I'm skeptical of. This will sound weird, but I think my options for me personally are divine determinism, simple foreknowledge, or open theism, one of those three, depending on some biblical stuff and some philosophical issues that I'm working through. Honestly, I'd be quite happy to know that Molinism is sound, but firstly, I think it has a bunch of philosophical objections and problems with it that I kind of want to work through. And then secondly, I don't think it accomplishes what the Molinists hope it will. And yeah, so that's kind of some of the stuff that I'm thinking. So one relevant idea to bear in mind is that the Christian has no obligation to believe in middle knowledge because there's no biblical precedent for it. And in fact, I think, I'll just make that statement right now. I believe that to be true. We can discuss that later if you want. But I think there's more biblical precedent for something like open theism than for Molinism personally. And we can discuss that, but I just don't think there's a biblical precedent. And so the majority of my arguments will be philosophical in nature rather than biblical. So I'm going to approach this as essentially philosophical rather than theological debate. And so I just wanted to take a look at some important ideas behind Molinism, namely that there are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom and that God's knowledge of these counterfactuals was used in his creative decision. And so I want to start out with a couple of questions for you actually that aren't objections per se, but are instead like questions of specificity and things that I think are necessary to defend Molinism. Firstly, I think you and I would agree that there are both true counterfactuals of creaturely freedoms. Well, I'm not sure if you and I would agree on the second point. I think we both agree there are true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, and I think that there are some which don't have truth value. I don't necessarily think that's a huge category, but I think there are things like 50-50 propositions, like things that don't necessarily have a leniency towards truth or falsity, and then there's just ones that are just really obscure, and that even someone like David Paulman, who I've discussed this with, would agree that there's no truth value, and we can get into those later if you want. But anyhow, Molinism assumes that there are enough true counterfactuals to enjoin meticulous providence. So why do you think that there are enough true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that God could entail meticulous providence in the world? Does that make sense?
Well, so I mean, this might be one of those where I have to admit a degree of ignorance to, like, if the question is, if we ask the question like, are there true counterfactuals to free choices? Are we asking like, do those things actually exist, or are we asking a question about like the ontology of truth makers? Like, is that what you're getting at?
Well, right now, I'm just saying that I think, I mean, I think you as a, well, obviously you as a Molinist think there are things that are true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So go back to what at least I assume you would go with this. My definition of omniscience is that God has knowledge of all true propositions. And so, that would still, that's a bare bones definition, but I think that that encapsulates what a lot of people would think of when they think of omniscience. And so that the open theist would use that, and I'm not using that in this way here, but the open theist would use that in a way to say that's why God can't know the future. It's a position that Richard Swinburne and Peter Van Inwagen take called involuntary notions, where God just cannot know future propositions. And so, so I'm not going to argue for that, but basically they would argue that there's just no truth value to free choices, and so that those in principle cannot be known. So anyhow, that's kind of the point of view that I'm coming from, is that the Molinists, I think, would have to argue for counterfactuals, certain counterfactuals of creaturely freedom being true. And so I'm just asking you, like, where do you get the idea that there are enough true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom for God to unfold his plan in a meaningful way on Molinism?
Well, so I'm hesitant to say that there are true counterfactuals, because then it sounds like you're saying that there's an ontology to these things that don't occur, right? And so I'm not necessarily willing to go that route, but I would modify it. And that's why when you gave the definition you did, God knows all true propositions, I immediately kind of backtracked, or not backtracked, but I immediately kind of went, well, I don't agree with that. And the reason is precisely because of what you said, because open theists use that to say, well, the future doesn't exist, so it's not a true thing right now that God can know. So I would say God knows all things that can be known, all things that are logical to be known. I would say counterfactuals, in certain cases, are things that can be known. And one of the reasons I would go, and we don't necessarily have to dive into the Bible, because I know you were saying most of your things were philosophical, but earlier when you said there's not a biblical basis for it, I think there is. I have an article by Tim Stratton up that I can pull up if you'd like to, that has several Bible verses that speak of that are counterfactuals, where God's referring to these things.
Yeah, so we can probably do that in just a second. So as far as the definition of omniscience, I think that the Molinist can actually accept my definition and still hold to there being true counterfactuals. Not to say of what I think of this, but there are a lot of Molinists that would say that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are things that exist in God's natural knowledge as a result of like brute facts, and so that they are true as a result of brute facts. Now, obviously, I don't want to argue against a position that you're not holding, so that might not be something that is useful to you. But let's get into some of the Bible stuff real quick. Let's maybe spend 5 or 10 minutes on that, because I think that's actually worth discussing a little bit, and then we can get into what you think makes a counterfactual of creaturely freedom knowable. Then we can go into that point. So.
Yeah, I mean, just starting before I say the Bible, I would just say God existing in his timeless state and the Trine Trinity just has knowledge of all things that are logically possible, and among those things are things of worlds he could create and what would happen in any of those worlds, and some of those include free creatures. Now, God could create a Calvinistic universe. He could create a universe and divinely determine everything that happens. And maybe even if one believes that that is the universe we're living in, even if a Calvinist says we are living in a universe that's divinely determined, I still think we could say it's still within God's power to have created a universe with free creatures, and he would know what those free creatures would do. So let me see real quick if it's going to be how conveniently I can bring this into the screen. That way we both can see it. Yeah, this might work. There we go. Does everybody see this? I think I don't know if everybody can read this. I don't know how big it is on the screen, but I'll read it out loud. So basically, this is an article Tim Stratton has on freethinkingministries.com. I highly suggest everybody go check that out. And so this is a section, God possesses counterfactual knowledge. And so John 15:23 and 24 says, if I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have sin. If I had not done among them the works that no one else did, they would not have sin. Then there's John 18:36. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from handing over the Jews. Matthew 26:24. Woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. So speaking obviously of Judas, and then there are others I have written down, although I would actually have to pull them out in a different way. But those would just be a couple that would be, I guess, enough to get us started.
Yeah. And so for me, so here's what I think of when I think about a lot of the debates, biblically speaking, over divine providence and what it looks like. Usually you'll see two categories of verses. You'll see a first category, which is what I would call strong proof texts, things that would, at least on the face of it, seem to directly entail the conclusion you're saying that they entail. And so, well, actually, I'm going to compare this to stuff on hell. So the eternal conscious torment view would point to, Jesus saying things like where the worm will never die, or the eternal fire, or something like that. And they'll point to that and they'll say, well, on the face of it, this supports eternal conscious torment. And then they might point to the second category of verses, which are some of the weaker ones, where it's one of those sort of 50-50, where you might say, well, this implies that my view is true, or this could be used to support it, or something like that, or this would make sense on the hypothesis that my view is true, but you can't really use it as a strong proof text. And I think that's the case when you look at divine providence too. I think that's the case with Molinism, with open theism. There's swamps of verses that open theists will give you. And I think some of them are strong in that first category of being strong, but I think others are definitely not, where I'm like, you're kind of stretching that a little bit. So some of the ones like the John verse are ones that I would sort of put in the weaker category, where it seems more like a turn of phrase to me, just on the face of it, than anything else. I think the Molinist's best bet is the 1 Samuel verse, where it talks about David and all that. I think that's the closest thing that you have. But I'm not sure that we can have good warrant from that one verse to infer God's middle knowledge. So that's, and I probably would want to move on from here. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Just a couple things on that. So I would never say do that, like take one verse and say, hey, this is the slam dunk. Now I do think certain verses do kind of slam dunk to say at least Calvinism is false. Certainly. Yeah, and of course that would depend on what kind of Calvinism you're talking about. So some verses would apply to say hybrid Calvinists, but not to other Calvinists. But in general, I am a cumulative case kind of guy. And this is where I think there are some verses, and I have not yet read Tim Stratton's new book, but one of the things he talks about doing, and I think this is the case that he does in his book, is he says, look, okay, here are some verses, and he just lists these verses, and he says, these are verses that Calvinists cite and say these support Calvinism. He says, so I just list all the verses that support Calvinism. I say, there you go, they support Calvinism. And then you have another position like Arminianism. And okay, here's all these verses that support Arminianism. And there's kind of different strengths and weaknesses to each position, because, there are certain verses that, as the Calvinist, you can say, my worldview makes sense of these verses. The problem is that their worldview doesn't make sense of all the verses. Same with the Arminian. Their worldview can make sense of some of the verses, but not all of them. And I would say that's the strength of Molinism. I would say Molinism, as a philosophical worldview, for me, makes sense of all the biblical data, where God is both divinely sovereign over human history, making everything, but also it allows for our free choices. And for us to be genuinely free and genuinely co-actualizers with God in this world. So that would be my thing, is I wouldn't just rest my case on, say, those 4 verses I read. That article actually goes into, it starts with, here's the verses for freedom, here's the verses for counterfactual knowledge, and then here's the verses for God's loving attitude towards all of the creatures he's created, and that kind of builds a cumulative case there.
Yeah, and so I think that's something that I do need to research more into, but I do think that is a really good point, because I can relate to that in a lot of other areas where I've been researching a lot into simple foreknowledge and open theism recently, and there are certain views that I think on simple foreknowledge would take some of the philosophical entailments of open theism that are positive, and explain them away well. So anyhow, point being, I think I can understand where you're coming from on that. But yeah, so I think that is something that I think is worth looking into. So but anyhow, to get back to some of the philosophy stuff. So you remind me how you defined omniscience again.
Oh, I think it's God knows all things that are possible to know.
All right.
And granted, the open theist might be comfortable with that definition because he might say, well, yeah, the future isn't a thing that is possibly known. Of course, I would just disagree with him on that.
Yeah. So what makes you think? Well, so here's two things. This is the second question that I had for you a little bit. So first of all, why would you think that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are in principle knowable things? And secondly, why do you think we should place these in his natural knowledge rather than his free knowledge? Because that's where Calvinists will put them. And if I decide to reject Molinism and accept something like open theism or simple foreknowledge, that's probably what I'll do too, is I'll say God does have knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. He just places them in his free knowledge they're placed in his free knowledge rather than his natural knowledge. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked the question. And I'll do my best to answer it. I will put a quick disclaimer before this is something I'm still thinking through, so I don't want to nail myself too heavily to the answer I'm about to give. I want to leave room that in the future I might kind of change and answer this differently. And so I'd put much more reliance on a guy like Tim Stratton or Braxton Hunter or like Flowers to answer the question.
And any questions you ask of my view will kind of be in that same boat as well, that I'm still in the process of formulating my views. So what I say here is kind of tentative more than certain.
Yeah.
So anyhow.
So the first question is why. So there's kind of two parts of that: is why I think there's counterfactuals that can be known, and then where do you place them in God's knowledge? And so to the first part, I just think just dwelling on what omniscience is. One of the examples I always give to my friends, right, is when I went to buy this iPhone. The guy's going behind the door, and he says it comes in 3 colors. You got the black, the white, and the red. Which one do you want? And of course I'm thinking, well, of those 3 colors, red's my favorite. It's not my ultimate favorite color, but of those 3 colors, red's my favorite. So I told him red. Now orange is my favorite color. And so it seems reasonable to me that if orange had been available, I would have picked orange. And it certainly seems that if I can have that knowledge of myself, that God, being omniscient and also knowing me better than I know myself, knowing all those details, God could easily know that if orange had been available, I would have picked orange. And so it's a trivial example, but I think when you ask, what reasons are there to think counterfactuals can be known? I think it would be much more of a stretch to think that would be something God couldn't know, that if there had been orange, who knows what one I would have picked. So I just think it seems intuitive to think counterfactuals can be known. If we can consider counterfactuals, then certainly an omniscient God can know counterfactuals. And the second part about where you place them, I think, and this gets a little bit into possible world semantics, which I know you said we might discuss later. We don't have to. But when we're talking about God's natural knowledge, and this includes knowledge of counterfactual creaturely freedoms, right? If I create free creatures, what are they going to freely choose? And in that sense, prior to God's creative decree, it's a bunch of different possibilities. There's a bunch of different possible worlds that are available to God, and then there's a subset that are feasible worlds that are available to God, and then there's the one he's going to create. And so I think the content of the knowledge is essentially the same. In possible world, prior to the creative decree, in his natural knowledge, there's knowledge of a possible world in which a certain set of events unfold. And then once he creatively decrees it, it's kind of like that knowledge of that possible world just changes categories until that's the actual world. So what was knowledge of a possible world kind of changes categories from being possible to the actual world. And then so God's, you said the free knowledge. I'm still memorizing those categories myself.
You're good. I've had to do a bunch of research recently onto separating the difference because I always get confused. I'm like, why is this in one thing rather than the other? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So God's free knowledge, I don't think is a new kind of knowledge that God gains. Rather, it's a set of knowledge that already exists in his natural knowledge of a possible world that just becomes knowledge of the actual world. So the knowledge changes kind of in content in that way, but it's not as though God learned something new, that this free knowledge is something new that God learns after it creates it. It's just that it turns from possible into actual. So that's kind of how I'd go about answering that.
Yeah, and so that is interesting that you bring that up, because I would make a statement something like this, that you can say of natural knowledge, this is one thing that is tentative for me, but you can say of natural knowledge, these are all the things that God says to himself. If I decree or decide to make the world this way, then this is how it will be. And then you can say of God's free knowledge, that God is saying, because I decreed it to be this way or decided for it to be this way, for those reasons, it is true that this is actually the case. So I agree to some extent that there's no actual knowledge. However, when you get into free creatures, and I think this is where I get into true counterfactuals and that type of thing, is you have the case of your phone, right? And so it seems easy on the surface to say something like, in X, or that, if, well, I'm not going to get there yet, but to say that, if the color orange had been available, then I would have picked it. Well, that does seem true, but there's also an extent to which, and actually I'm going to start entering into one of my objections to this, is that there seems to be an interesting, like some sort of a contradiction, not a contradiction as such, like in a logical sense where there's an actual contradiction, but it seems that there's a difficulty in reconciling counterfactuals of creaturely freedom and the principle of alternative possibilities, because to me it seems that the principle would suggest that in situation S, a person P can do either A or not A, but then counterfactuals of creaturely freedom suggest that in situation S, P will do A and he will always do A. And so ultimately, it seems that if you accept the PAP says that in S, P can do either A or not A, and that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom suggest there is a fact of the matter that says that in S, P will do A, to me that seems almost like a mutually inexclusive proposition, because to say that you will always do one of a possible two options, if you're already saying, and I think that, and I understand that that the concept of free will, or PAP is not necessary for free will. I dispute that a little bit, but in general I agree. At least in concept I agree. But I think that when you look at it, the PAP is really important, and it seems to contradict the PAP to say, because the PAP would almost say that there is no true proposition here about what I would necessarily do, but then counterfactuals of creaturely freedom seem to say there is a fact of the matter that you will do this. So,
well, it depends on what you mean by necessary there. Like, do we be necessary as in causally determined, or necessary just in that, well, given these circumstances, this is what he will do?
And see, when you use that language, to me, it sounds like determinism. And I don't mean that in any way that I think that Molinists are secret determinists or anything like that. But when you think about it, and here's an interesting thought. So think about.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt. Let me write it down so you can continue saying that I don't lose thought. Well, no, I was just gonna say, because part of what's necessitating it, like, you can use the word determined in both circumstances, and you can say, well, there's the kind of this determinism that the Molinist is smuggling in, but of course the source of it matters. So if the source in say world A is all external sources of determinism, then you're right, the agent isn't freely choose. But if in this other possible world, if part of that determinism is self-determination, that the creature is the source of part of that choice, that there's all these other influencing factors, of course, but at least part of what is the outcome is self-determined, then you can use the determined in both senses. But of course the difference is huge there.
Yeah, that's true. And so for me, what I'm thinking about is, all right, so think about let's just say that God had chosen to make a world where something like Bohmian mechanics or multi-worlds interpretation was true of quantum physics. And then there's purely physical things, no free agents whatsoever. And so basically you're in a world that is a fully deterministic system. And so it makes sense to say, when you're talking about purely deterministic systems in the way that we're talking about, that to say that if we had extensive knowledge or exhaustive knowledge of all of this stuff, that we would know, for instance, if I threw a rock in space, that it would, over, you know, the course of billions of years of going through billions and trillions of light years in the galaxy, that was the wrong assortation of billions and trillions, but you know what I'm saying.
Yes, you're good.
That it's going through all these things, it necessarily will go this way and that way and that way and that way because of all these physical forces that are interacting on it. It makes sense to say that we would have certain knowledge of what that would necessarily do if we knew all the surrounding circumstances. But with free agents, I don't necessarily think that's always the case. And so what I would argue for is one of these two positions is probably what I would think is true. I think that God does have exhaustive knowledge of our essences, but I think if our essences are actually free, you know, that. You there? Sorry, we went out for a second.
Yeah, no, you're good. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Your picture's still frozen, but your audio, I think, is back.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're good.
All right. Okay, good. Am I still frozen?
No, you're good. You're back all the way.
Good. Yeah. So I don't know if that was my side or your side, but if it's mine, I'm sorry.
Oh no, he froze again. I can hear you clicking.
Is this my side? I legit can't tell.
That's the thing, is I don't know. I mean, you're freezing on my screen. I'm not freezing on my screen, so that makes me. But that still could be my side. I don't know. You're back now, though. Your video's back and everything.
All right, I can't hear you at the moment.
You can't hear me? Uh-oh.
Technical difficulties.
Yeah. Let me see. People. Oh, I think he got out. He's going to come back. Yeah. People comment and let me know if you can hear me on Facebook and on YouTube. I can try making sure my microphone is plugged in. StreamYard has not told me. I can check into the settings here. Audio. Yep, according to here, my microphone is working. Can you hear me now?
There, yeah, I can hear you. You just went out for a second. Anyhow, so I would affirm that God has exhaustive knowledge of an essence, someone that God could instantiate in a possible world. So, you know, you would say that you and I have an essence, and that, you know, Tim Stratton, Chewbacca has an essence, or something like that. Anything that God could actualize. Sorry, are you still there? You keep going in and out, so I'm just trying to.
No, I can still hear you. The picture is freezing, and then it comes back and then freezes. But your audio is good. Yeah, there you go. Video's back now. Maybe not. He might have just 9:34. Yeah, again, I apologize to you. Let me know if you guys can hear me as this is going on, because then that would at least tell me if it were my side. If I'm going out for the viewers as well, then I'll know I need to fix something. So definitely let me know in the comments. It's actually, if you can still hear me on Facebook while Kyle's absent, let me get to this point that someone's bringing up on Facebook. He says, device not connected. I will temporarily get there.
I honestly don't know what's going on here. I think it might be on my side. I'm pretty sure it is, but we'll see. We'll if it happens again, we'll burn that bridge when we get there. So
yeah.
All right. So where was I? Okay. So
God has exhaustive knowledge of essence.
Yeah, God has exhaustive knowledge of our essences. So I would agree with that. But what I would probably be closer to affirming at this point is to say that God has extremely high probabilistic knowledge of certain choices that we could make. And I'm talking about in his natural knowledge, right? Because essences would be in his natural knowledge. when something would be actualized, it would be in his free knowledge. And so, and we're talking of essences, things that possibly could be instantiated. We're talking natural knowledge. So anyhow, in his natural knowledge, I would say he has over, I'm not sure to say about how many choices or situations or something, but I'm willing to say that he probably has some knowledge of certain things to say, if I put this person in this situation, then it seems pretty likely that they would do this or this or that. But I'm not willing to say that there's this truth factor to it that says that they will do this or they will do that. And so at least not until they're actualized. So that's kind of where the debate is for me right now. I'm trying to decide if how I think a lot of that works. But I think I'm willing to go with you insofar as to say that, and to draw this back. So this is going back to your analogy of your phone. And there's a lot of these really intuitive things that give us the impression that we have this knowledge of counterfactuals as humans ourselves. And so where I would reject that is saying this, is that for one, we overestimate I think we overestimate certainty in this case. And so what I mean by that is just epistemically speaking. And this part of this comes from me as being a fallibilist, just epistemically. But I don't know that there's anything which we can say we have 100% certainty of. And so for one thing, I think I think it's just a casual thing. I think it's fine that we act as if we have certainty about certain things.
Right.
But I don't think that there's things that you and I would say we have certainty over, that if you actually dig into them and think about it, you're like, this is really more of something that I think is highly probable, or that I think is likely, or more likely than not. I don't think that these are things that we say we have certainty over. So like I said, I think I'm willing to go as far as saying that in God's natural knowledge, because that's what we're talking about when it comes to middle knowledge, it's just a subsect of his natural knowledge. I think I'm willing to go with you as far as saying that God has some knowledge because of his exhaustive knowledge of essences, but I don't know that I would say that he has the knowledge of all situations exhaustively, such that he could meticulously order the world, instantiating all of those situations and making all of those things true, so that necessarily they would do freely all these things in all these situations.
Sure. So a couple things. So the argument I was making didn't require me being certain that I would choose the orange iPhone had it been available, or even that I was certain that prior to purchasing the red iPhone, that I was 100% certain that I would purchase the red iPhone. Just with the same degree of certainty, say prior to purchasing the red phone, that I would pick the red phone. Of course, I could have chosen differently. Maybe, I don't know, they say that the black iPhone is $100 cheaper or something like that, and that, unbeknownst to me, but with the relatively same degree of certainty I had that I would choose the red iPhone, I could have the same degree of certainty that I would choose the orange iPhone in the other circumstances. But of course, that's just making a statement about me. God, being omniscient, knows which one I would freely do. Now, to the other point, when you were talking about God having this in his natural knowledge, I mean, I think, to me, it just seems right that he would. I mean, if in his natural knowledge there's a possible world in which I'm only presented with the original three options, he knows that I would freely choose the red iPhone. And there's another possible world where, let's say, everything's the same except there's four options, including the orange. He knows in that possible world I would freely choose the orange iPhone. Then even though this world with the red iPhone is the actual world, because he has in his natural knowledge of that other possible world, he can have that counterfactual knowledge of, had the orange iPhone been available, he would have chosen the orange iPhone. And so, like, again, there's this idea of what's a possible world in his natural knowledge becoming the actual world in his free knowledge. It's just kind of shifting categories. And so then I would kind of ask you, though, why think that, number one, God couldn't have this kind of counterfactual knowledge? And we'll get back to where you said that contradicted the PAP, because I disagreed with you there. But then it almost sounds like you would have to be an open theist if you're saying God couldn't have a 100% certainty of what a creature would freely do if he put them in a certain set of circumstances. It sounds like you would kind of have to be either an open theist, or, if you do think God has the knowledge, a divine determinist.
Well, okay, so I think that there is at least the option there of simple foreknowledge, which, to be fair, I'm still exploring that. I kind of lean towards that. But anyhow, but I admittedly, I do have some philosophical leniency towards thinking that something like involuntary notions is true, that God can't have certainty about those things. But just for the purposes here, what I would be saying is, I just, in his natural knowledge, I don't think he has that knowledge. I'm willing to go and say that God has free knowledge, or that in his free knowledge, once those persons are actualized, that, for instance, God will know with 100% certainty, or okay, certainty is not quite the right word, because there's a connotation to certainty that doesn't necessarily correlate to the concept of truth. More of what I'm thinking of here is a sort of yes/no question, right? And so there are some questions that can be answered yes, some questions that can be answered no, and some that can be either yes or no. And so I would say that I feel like when it comes to God having a knowledge to say, because think about, it's easy with a simple choice and something that's really intuitive to say that God has knowledge of that, like you picking the orange iPhone. But that's what I was talking about earlier, about when God would have knowledge of relevant counterfactuals, because I think there are much more nuanced cases that we can trot out. So think about this, for instance. So I'm a big Lego fan. So let's say I go to Walmart, because I'm from the South and we love to go to Walmart. Let's say I go to Walmart and I look for a Lego space Lego set, and I pick this one set, and on this shelf there's 2 boxes of the exact same set, same price, same exact condition. I don't. It may be true. I'm willing to admit it may be true that there is no true counterfactual for which of those 2 I will pick. But at very least, if you want to say there is some sort of relevant counterfactual knowledge to whether I pick the left box or the right box, it does seem that that's just a very nuanced, middling choice, where I don't know that even if you had maximal knowledge of what a person is like, that in his natural knowledge, God knows, oh, in that situation, Kyle's going to pick the right box over the left box. To me, it seems more likely, if you want to say that God has counterfactual knowledge in that situation, to just say it's more probable, it's more likely true that Kyle will pick the left box rather than the right box. However, it's also possible that God could pick the right box. So that's kind of where I'm going. And I think that in the case of simple foreknowledge, that would not bend into open theism, because simple foreknowledge would say that God only has knowledge of what free creatures would do after his decision to create. And so for me, I'm just saying I reject putting that knowledge of counterfactuals being true in his natural knowledge. I just put it in his free knowledge.
See, I would say it sounds to me like you're saying that there's something ontologically random about you choosing the left or the right box. Because if you're not arguing that there's something ontologically random about it, then of course, even if, say, from your epistemic position it's random, oh, I grab the first one I see, or maybe I see both of them, but I just grab the right one, and it seems epistemically random to me. But of course, if it's not ontologically random, then there are maybe dozens, maybe hundreds of, say, subconscious factors that are going into you grabbing the right box. And of course, God, being omniscient, would know all of those factors.
Yeah, and so this is getting into a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, that I feel like Molinists sometimes use the language of determinism in some ways, because you're talking about subconscious factors and stuff like that, and to me that just sounds like a subset of determinism, or something like compatibilism. Because if you're talking about these and obviously I totally agree that there are factors affecting you, but I reject that those have exhaustive causal power over you. I would still say that you're the prime mover.
Well, right, but my point is, and that this is what happens sometimes to Calvinists. So I'm not saying you're deliberately doing this, but I'll give an explanation like the one I gave, and you'll say, okay, well then if you weren't, say, consciously thinking to yourself, I want the right box because of X reasons, and I don't want the left box because of X reasons, and I just kind of give this case where maybe there's these subconscious factors that kind of contribute, that, oh, well, then that's just determined. The problem is that's one circumstance, right? And sure, the Calvinist worldview might be able to make sense of those circumstances, but there are other circumstances where we heavily deliberate over options. So I'm fine saying that there are these circumstances where we make choices, and you can call them determined. You can say we weren't libertarian free in some of our decisions, but of course, so long as we are libertarianly free in other decisions, even if there are very few of the decisions we make in our lives, then we do have libertarian free will. And it doesn't refute that case to say, well, there are these some circumstances where the choice is closer to being determined.
Yeah, and so here's what I'm thinking. So, and I think after this we should get to your thing of the pack, because I have a few other objections that I want to get to. And I don't want to spend too long.
Real quick, last sentence on that, not to interrupt you, but the last sentence, the relevant point I'm trying to make is that God's omniscience covers all of the circumstances. It covers the ones that are closer to determinism, and also the ones where I deliberate more.
Yeah, and so what I'm thinking of here is that think about is that they're what I would call the obvious cases of you and your orange iPhone or iPhone case. I don't know, is the case orange or is the phone orange?
Mine is red. I would have bought an orange one if it would have been available.
Yeah. But so there's an obvious case like that, and then there's a non-obvious case like what I brought up, or something like what I brought up, where it's not necessarily clear whether or not one of those is true or false. And I know you slightly disputed that, but my point being is that it seems like there's a spectrum of these largely certain things versus these largely uncertain things. And for me, at least on my view, I would say that there's no truth value to that until those essences are actualized, such that God can say with really high probability about some things, well, hey, I could instantiate this situation and Stillman would do this, so that I should probably instantiate this to do this. But I don't know that God has enough of those to string along in a line and say that I can use this to determine these things, or not determine in that sense, but, you know, to fix events in such a way, in situations such that all these people will do these things freely. So,
okay, so see, this to me is where I don't know if there's, like I've admitted there's a distinction in natural knowledge and free knowledge, whereas one case it's possible, the other case it's the actual. But I don't think there's a distinction in the content where it sounds like you're making the distinction. So again, when you say things like God can have knowledge of a high degree of probability, then it just sounds like open theism. And maybe you can explain what your definition is of simple foreknowledge, because that might clear up where we're missing each other. But it seems to me that let's say we're talking about the actual world, we're talking about God's free knowledge. And if we would agree that in God's free knowledge, he can have knowledge certainly that Stillman would freely, say, choose the vanilla ice cream over the chocolate ice cream, then it seems to me that all of a sudden, if we're talking about God's natural knowledge prior to his decree of creation, I don't think he'd be thinking, well, probably if I create Stillman and put him in circumstance A, that he'll choose the vanilla. It seems to me that God, being omniscient of, in one case being in his free knowledge being completely omniscient of my essence, but in his natural knowledge being completely omniscient of what my essence would be were he to create me, that God can have certainty that were I to create free creature Stillman and were I to create him with this essence, that he would freely choose vanilla over chocolate in circumstance A.
Yeah, and so just to differentiate, so, and to be fair, this is still something I'm sort of parsing out, trying to understand in my view, is the concept of simple foreknowledge and what that actually looks like in the context of the creative decision / decree. But so the difference between me and an open theist is the open theist would say something like, God just can never have knowledge of these future events of what humans would freely do. So for God, every single bit of knowledge he could possibly have about free creatures is always going to be in a probabilistic sense. Because the best that he can know, you know, because he's temporal on open theism, so that's a really important aspect of open theism. But at least I think all open theists would agree with that, as far as I'm aware. So that's a really important aspect of open theism.
Yeah, because I think if they held to something like a B theory or something, then of course the future would already exist and God could know it.
Yes, and I think that something similar to that applies if you're temporal, if God is atemporal, excuse me. Which obviously is something that I'm inclined to agree with, and I'm sure that that's your position. And so
I will say, and this might not be relevant to the discussion, I do hold to an A theory of time, and I do think that God exists timelessly sans creation, but that he does enter into time, become temporal with creation. that probably isn't relevant to this discussion, though. We might.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, I'm kind of still debating. There's some theological entailments of B theory that I'm not a huge fan of, but I'm also not sure about A theory, so I'm still looking into that. But anyhow, and part of that would affect this because people that are real big proponents of simple foreknowledge tend to be B theorists. So someone who's a really big proponent of it is Alex Proust, and so I've been having email discussions with Alex Proust, and the way he would describe God's creative decision is that it takes place in many different explanatory moments, where one would, God is making a block. So it's block theory of time in essence, and where God's going from the beginning of block to the end. And so he now knows, he instantiates an essence, and he now knows the full thing that essence will do. And so he builds things around that and makes his plan according to that, and so on until the block is made. So part of this is I'm not sure how that would work on A theory. But anyhow, the open theist, differentiating simple foreknowledge and open theism. Open theists would say, in principle, God can never have that knowledge with certainty. Yeah, I'm not sure about B theory myself, that's for sure.
I'm not a fan, but yeah.
C theory is worse, though. But anyhow, sorry, Kyle Allender is going to hate me for that, but it's true. And so...
as long as it's dynamic, it's okay.
Yeah, so...
Because there really is I shouldn't go off on this tangency, but there really is what would you call it? Like only two options there's not only two options if you're talking A theory versus B theory, but there is only two options if you're talking dynamic or non-dynamic. And I would say I'm convinced that at least some version of dynamic time has to be true.
And I'm not convinced that you can't have something like eternalism and something like presentism, but that's totally off topic. So the open theist would say that in principle, God can never have knowledge of what the free creature would do. The person of simple foreknowledge, and the part of this where I'm not sure about it is I'm not sure about the mechanics of how this would work. But the person who believes in simple foreknowledge would say, in God's natural knowledge, he has that probabilistic knowledge to say that it seems really likely, or 99% or 50% or something like that, anywhere in between, that if I put person P in situation S, then he will do A. That's really, really likely. But then when he actualizes it in his free knowledge, when those people become actual, when they actually make those decisions, that's when God says, okay, that's what they did do. Or, it's difficult to put temporal language on it because obviously God's atemporal, but that is the thing that they chose to do. So
does that require a B theory?
I'm not sure. That's the thing I'm not certain about.
It sounds like it to me, because otherwise, if it's an A theory, you would have to argue, not you, but the person making this argument would have to argue that God gains some kind of knowledge by actualizing the world, such that he can say, okay, I thought they would probably do this. Now I know they will do this. There has to be something he's gaining. If it's not, well, something he's gaining either way, but it would either be something he's gaining by virtue of the creation, or if he actualizes a B theory and then can see the end and say, oh, I was right, I know now, then he's still gaining something either way.
And so I'm not certain about that. There's some ways that I'm kind of trying to work around right now, thinking through that, where I'm thinking you can do it on A theory. I'm just trying to figure out, like, how plausible is it? Because you can always figure out a way, or you can usually find a way to work something around a certain thing in your own philosophical views, but it's a matter of how ad hoc it is or something like that. But yeah, I'm still thinking through that. But I'm inclined to think that something like that is true, that a B theory would be the better option for something like simple foreknowledge. So, But yeah, anyhow, you want to get to the PAP and stuff? I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and just kind of not to rehash it, but because you're saying, well, it seems that there's a range of things we can discuss when we talk about counterfactual. There's kind of just a range of complications that go into these truths. In one case, you're talking about an iPhone, which you have certain certainty about, but then you're talking about just picking a right box or a left box. And I would say, yes, there's a range of circumstances. There's a range of kinds of choices we make. There's a range of all these different things. Some require more deliberation, some require less deliberation. I would say libertarian free will is compatible with all of them, and God's knowledge is also compatible with all of this, because God can know me so well, he knows what I'll freely do, but he can also know subconscious factors so well. He knows if I'll just randomly choose, quote unquote, randomly, right? Not random to him. But, so God's knowledge covers just all of that to me. So and I like to use specific examples. because I admit I have trouble following along when somebody's saying, well, P and then A and then X, and then, you know,
I can relate. I've learned to spout it off myself, but then people will do it, and I'm like, good gosh, is this what I sound like?
I mean, no, you said I understood what you said, but it gets harder for me. So I'll use a good example. So the principle of alternate possibilities would be something like, I went to the store and I like both chocolate and vanilla ice cream, and maybe normally I'd buy both, but just, you know, to have a range of flavors and be able to change it up in my own house. But my paycheck was short this week. I only have enough to purchase one of those kinds of ice cream, and let's say I choose vanilla. Now here's the point I would make is, whereas a Calvinist might want to argue that, oh, that vanilla was the only choice compatible with my nature. I just want to say, as somebody who affirms libertarian freedom, that both choices were compatible with my nature. Choosing vanilla was compatible with my nature, and choosing chocolate was compatible with my nature. And I would say, because both of those things are compatible with my nature, I have the principle of alternative possibilities. I chose vanilla, but I could have chosen chocolate. Now, we can get into the reasons I chose vanilla. Maybe it was something more of just kind of a whim, like you're saying with the Legos, but maybe it was something more I'm thinking of, well, I have, say, certain candy accessories at my house, and they just happen to go better with vanilla, right? So I actually put some thought into this. So there's a principle of alternative possibilities. I choose vanilla, but I could have chosen chocolate. Choosing chocolate was compatible with my nature. I could have craved chocolate or whatever. Now it doesn't seem to me to be contradictory at all to say that there's a counterfactual to that. That, let's say, for some reason, I brought my brother with me to the store, and I was about to go for the vanilla, and he said, "Oh, you know, I really like chocolate," and I say, "Oh, well, I like chocolate too." This way, we're both pleased, so I grabbed the chocolate. But it was, even in that circumstance, it was still compatible with my nature to choose vanilla. And so there's these counterfactual circumstances there, but neither of them negate the fact that the opposite choice, the PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities, was within my nature. That choice was within my nature to be able to pick. So in that kind of circumstances, I just don't see what the contradiction is.
Gotcha. So actually, that brings something up that I kind of want to get to later, the modality objection that I was talking about. So actually, what I want to do right now, because I noticed we're almost an hour in, I want to put a pin in that so we can save that for later, and then later I can, if we have time, I can respond to that, and we can talk about my modality objection and discuss that too. But okay. I want to get to kind of my two most potent objections. Let's start with this one. This one that I call the non-difference objection. So this is my objection that I don't think Molinists get what they want out of Molinism comparatively to Calvinism. So picture the following two scenarios. A man mind controls another man such that he shoots his wife with a gun. So this is the situation on Calvinism. And the Calvinists would probably say that's an unfair reading or whatever, and that's fine. We're just these are the typical type of things.
Yeah, I mean, you could compare you could compare naturalistic determinism if you want, unless the Calvinism is relevant to the point.
Yeah, it is relevant to the point. Okay. And so this is just comparing some of the things on Calvinism that the Molinists would prefer on Molinism. And so and so basically that I don't think that necessarily the Molinist gets what they want out of Molinism. I don't think that everything that the Molinists would prefer to get out of it that they do. So basically a man mind controls another man, so he shoots his wife with a gun. And so this is the situation on Calvinism, and I think obviously the Calvinists would probably disagree, or they probably want some pedanticness in there. But these are the general things that someone who believes in libertarian free will would bring up to say this would make God immoral. But then take another is where a man puts another man intentionally in a situation such that he will freely choose to shoot his wife with a gun. And so to me, that sounds like Molinism. And for me, I think I can actually agree with the Calvinists, as I mentioned, that I think there is moral culpability on Calvinism. However, a lot of Molinists that I know, and I don't know if you're in this camp, but I would assume that you are, is that would say that something like that God is not, because the person freely chose to do it, that God does not have moral culpability in that case. But to me, I think that there is moral culpability in that case, and we can get a little bit more into that. I have a little paragraph as to specifying why I think that's the case. But I think that that is the case, that if you think that God is morally culpable for the actions of creatures on Calvinism, you should also think the same on Molinism.
Okay, so I'm going to disagree, and let me see real quick before I give my response. I know in one of these articles I was looking at, Tim Stratton, he had a relevant, and I wouldn't bring it up if it weren't like seriously relevant.
No problem. I tried to read all of his articles on Molinism, but then I just didn't end up doing it. I just ended up listening to a bunch of stuff, so I never really got down to a lot of his articles.
For me, listening is way better than reading, because I'm a visual learner. So if even if it's just I'm seeing somebody give the lecture, it just burns into my brain better than reading. So I can't remember. Oh, you know where it is? I bet it's here. Sorry.
You're good. Take your time.
I just want to get this right, because this is a very important point you're bringing up.
Yes.
And I just want to make sure.
And I just want to state for the record that I think I've already said this once, but I don't have any problem with God in the way that a lot of LFW people would on Calvinism. But I do see that regularly on Molinists, and that's kind of where this is targeted at. So.
Yeah. Okay, I think I found it. Okay, so here's the point. So the source is the relevant distinction here. This is a huge distinction. So you wanted to say there's somebody mind controlling somebody in the Calvinist. I know they wouldn't like that thing, but here's the thing. To the hyper-Calvinist, right, God creates human beings, and certain human beings are created with such a nature that given that nature, there's only one choice they could make in any given set of circumstances. So the source is not themselves or the decision. The source is ultimately their nature. And certain Calvinists will admit this. They'll say, well, I get to choose what I want. And what more could you want from free will than the ability to choose what I want? But of course, ultimately, if your wants are not up to you, then to me, it doesn't matter. If your wants are, say, determined by an external source, whether that be nature of evolution or whether that be God who creates the nature, then your choices aren't up to you because they're determined by your wants, by your nature, and that nature was not up to you. So in that sense, I do not think that the individual has the same kind of moral culpability there, because their decisions were ultimately determined completely by external factors. Now, in a second circumstance where, say, God puts person in the circumstance, now, again, I'm going to give the similar response I would to evil. I don't think God directly causes evil. So I would say God created a world in which he did allow some person to end up in a circumstance where, say, he'd be strongly tempted to murder his wife. But so long as there aren't external factors that determine the person to murder the wife, namely even the circumstance that God allowed the person to be in didn't force him to pull the trigger, he's still at the relevant time made that decision himself. It was determined by internal factors, his free will, his free choice, and he allowed the external influences to get the better of him. He chose freely to act on his anger, to, maybe he had certain future plans. Maybe I'm going to get her life insurance or something. But the relevant distinction is, in the Calvinist worldview, all of that is external factors that contribute to the choice. In the Molinistic framework, it's the internal factors that I chose. And so there is a moral culpability, because you can say God allowed him to fall into circumstances, but number one, that's not God determining him to murder his wife, and nor is the circumstances determining to his wife. God allows him to fall into circumstances that influence him to kill his wife, but he ultimately is what he self-determines to act on his instincts, to act on his influences and kill her. And just real quick to kind of drive this point home biblically, I'm going to, I think, import the same screen. Hopefully this is the correct one here. Are we looking at this? Oh, no, we're looking at the wrong one. Yeah, this is Ezekiel. Yeah, the Ezekiel verse. I really like this one. Ezekiel 18:30 and 32. Therefore, you Israelites, I will judge each of you according to your own ways, declares the sovereign Lord. Repent, turn away from all your offenses. Then sin will not be your downfall. Rid yourselves of all the offenses you have committed and get a new heart and a new spirit. Why will you die, people of Israel? For I take no pleasure in the death of anyone, declares the sovereign Lord. Repent and live. And then just a couple chapters later in Ezekiel 33, 10 through 11, Son of man, say to the Israelites, this is what you are saying. Our offenses and sins weigh us down, and we are wasting away because of them. How then can we live? Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, people of Israel? And the reason I read that scripture is because that's a relevant distinction. If God wants them to turn away from their evil ways, that worked against Calvinism, where he gives them a nature such that they cannot turn from their evil ways. Yet he's commanding them to do something that he gave them a nature that they could not do. Yet on Molinism, if we have libertarian free will, then we are at least capable. The man who's about to murder his wife is capable of following the Lord's command to turn away from that way, to not kill her, to actually obey the command that he's given. And that's because he's ultimately self-determined by internal factors, not determined by completely external factors, as would be the case in Calvinism.
Okay, so I think that two things that I would say. So for the first thing, so the second thing is I'm just going to read that that paragraph out that I had written down, because I think it gets to the heart of kind of what I'm thinking here. The first thing is that I think where I would agree with the Molinist is that you do get certainly moral culpability for the individual person. But I also think that because dig into the scenarios again, these are the scenarios that someone like Braxton Hunter or Tim Stratton would bring out to the Calvinists to say this clearly makes God look immoral. And the point of the thing is, you know, the man who's mind controlling the other guy, that's Calvinism and that's God. Or the man intentionally puts another guy in a situation where he knows that he will freely choose to shoot his wife. On those situations, if you're just going off of moral intuition alone, you should say that in both of those cases that the man is morally culpable. Now, I agree in the second case, both the man and the guy who shoots his wife are definitely both morally culpable. But basically, if the Molinist thinks that God gets off the hook, morally speaking, in that case, then I don't think that's the case. So, and here's
I wouldn't affirm the kind of point of the analogy where you just made. Whereas in one analogy, there's a guy mind controlling another person, and that's what forced him to do it. And then the second person is the guy mind controlling him, and he chooses to do it. I don't think God's mind controlling in the second circumstance. I think God creates a world in which people fall into evil circumstances. He allows them to choose evil, and he has overriding reasons why he allows the evil ultimately to continue. Whereas on the Calvinistic worldview, I don't think you even get that defense, because whatever overriding good God wants in that circumstance, well, he could have just determined that by another way, by not determining an evil thing.
Okay, so I want to dig into your language here a little bit, because you're using the language of God allowing evil. And so what I want to ask you is that, try not to put this in the symbolic language to help you out, but any possible situation, because we're talking about a Molinism, we're talking about God putting a person in a situation and that person freely choosing to do a certain thing. Do you think that God has exhaustively determined all situations in the course of human history? As a
for lack of better language, I'll affirm that.
Okay. Because I think, and I don't want to like force anything on you because of the language, but it does seem like you have to say, I don't think you can acknowledge, and here's why, I don't think you can acknowledge that God is, or I don't think you can say that God's just allowing this evil to happen. Well, I think that God is a direct causal factor in this case, in addition to the other agent.
Yeah, but the reason I'm going to object, because it sounds like the way you're putting it, it's like you have this guy who's just happy-go-lucky, he's otherwise a good person, and then God just plucks him out of his nice, cushy little life and then just sticks him in a circumstance where now God knows he's going to murder his wife. No, God creates a world in which history unfolds in a certain way. It's not that this guy is just making all these good choices all his life and then God just rips him out of his happy situation and forces him in this terrible thing. No, maybe the guy grew up in a household where his parents made free choices that maybe to get a divorce and move into a bad neighborhood, and that terribly affected him. And then he, even though given multiple opportunities in his life to make good choices, freely chooses bad circumstances, freely chooses to meet a woman who's, say, terrible. And I'm not saying that she's to blame for murder. I'm not saying anybody behaving terribly warrants them being killed. I'm not saying that. But there's a bevy of choices that lead to this guy's ending up in this circumstance. And God, yes, God determined to create a world in which the history would unfold in that circumstance. But of course, it's all relevant. If people freely make free choices that puts them into bad circumstances, which then leads to them doing a bad thing, they are the ones morally culpable for it. And God having overriding goods that can come out of allowing that bad thing to happen. But of course, as the passage would show, is still that worldview is still compatible with God pleading with people, with commanding them to turn away, to make the good choice, to not make the bad choice. And if they disregard the commands of God, they're the ones morally responsible. And it does no good for them to wave their fist at God and say, well, you decreed to create the world in which I would end up in this circumstance. Well, no, maybe you should have made better choices to not end up in that circumstance.
Okay, so here's what I want to get into. Here's the problem as I see it, and I wrote this out beforehand, so there is a little bit of that symbolic language, but I'll try to read it slowly so that I make sure that you understand it. So here's, for me, the problem is as follows: God actualizes a situation S where the agent will freely choose A, and so in this case, we're just going to qualify A as whatever God wants the agent to do as a part of His divine provident plan. So, and then not A is something that would be outside of his. Oh, sorry. Do you have
I don't want to cut you off for the knee, but yes, I would have problems right off the get go with that.
Okay, so why would you have problems with that then? Because unless you don't think meticulous providence is true as a Molinist, which I think is inconsistent Molinism, but
no, I do think it's true. But I would just have a language. If you say God actualizes S and then A occurs, I agree with that. But then you say, and that necessitates that God wants A to happen. Well, no, it could be the case that God say. It's not that he wants someone to kill their wife. I mean, we would know from scripture that he doesn't want, people to do evil. He doesn't want, but only God would be in a position to know if he creates circumstance. So let's say he goes out of his way to create circumstance T so that A will not occur because it's evil, but then he knows that all these overriding evils will occur because he didn't allow the lesser evil to occur.
Okay, so
therefore he elects to create S, allowing A to happen because there's overriding goods that come from it.
So when I define A, I don't necessarily mean that he wants it to happen in the sense that God's like, yay, I want this to happen, so much as in the sense that God has a plan and that he needs to allow evil things to happen, and then that evil thing occurring would be a part of him achieving the greater good in the ultimate sense. So that would be more of the sense that I'm talking about. So anyhow, so God actualizes a situation S where the agent will freely choose A. God actualizes a world where all situations S are actualized such that all agents will freely choose A. Because God actualized S, it is in principle not possible for agents to choose not A. And that's probably where your objection. I'm going to keep going, but I think you would probably have an objection there. If it is not possible for an agent to choose not A, then God has in essence determined, well, okay, I'm not going to use determined, I'm going to use the word guaranteed the agent to choose A by choosing to actualize situation S. God's choice to actualize S is what resulted in the agent's free action. What follows from this is the following. If the agent wanted to perform his action, but because of his situation, he could not do otherwise. If you want to say he could do otherwise, then you must say either that the agent has some power over actualizing situation S, or that in S, P can choose not A versus A. Now, if the agent wanted to perform his action but could not do otherwise, this sounds to me a lot like soft determinism. And so for me, in order for this to be true, I think all you have to agree to is the following, is that God is exclusively responsible for actualizing the full set of S. For each situation S, P will not choose A, and then God actualizes S. So for me, I mean, I think that's my problem. That's a little bit of a throwing spaghetti at the wall, but I think you understand.
No, I mean, I'll have to help you I'll have you help me by reminding me of things because unfortunately I can't write down certain premises, and I know there were certain ones I disagreed with.
Yes.
So I'm trying to remember the first one. that I disagree
Yeah,
with, and
so
I can't remember it.
do you agree? Well, do you agree with this? God actualizes a world where all situations S are actualized such that all agents will freely choose A. So basically,
Sure.
God
That's a
actualizes
good one. Yeah.
all. Okay, yeah. Okay, and so this is probably the first one you disagree with. Because God actualized S, it is in principle not possible for agents to choose not A.
Yeah,
That is probably the one where you disagree. And so I
yeah,
want
and
to
I
get
would just
into
say it
why.
doesn't follow, and precisely because it doesn't follow because of the wording that you used in the premise prior to that, which is God actualized the situation S, which means that creatures will freely choose A. So B, if as long as that's why I use the language of multiple choices being within a person's being multiple options being compatible with one's given nature. Just because someone will freely choose A doesn't mean that B or C wasn't compatible with his nature. And so long as B and C was compatible with his nature, it was possible for that agent to choose A, B, or C given circumstance S. It's just that he wouldn't freely choose B or C.
Yeah, and so for me, that just sounds like, I don't know, because I think it seems to me that the Molinist has to agree that God has at least guaranteed S to happen. Now we can debate how that happens. The Molinist or the Calvinist would say God has guaranteed it because he's determined it, and the Molinist would say God has guaranteed it because the agent would freely choose that. But to me, it seems like God has guaranteed all these situations to happen.
It's both, and it's not exclusively. Here's another perhaps important point to keep as far as God providentially ordering the world so as to bring about his outcomes. Is it's not as if God's act of doing that lies solely in his determining of circumstances in which free creatures would find themselves in. It's also in the free choices of the creatures themselves. If God knows a creature is going to choose to do an evil action, but he knows a good outcome will come from it, then he allows that person. Because here's the thing, God, we agree, God could just cut off people at the knees every time. He could just make every gun that's about to kill an innocent person not work, or shoot duds or fire blanks. He could do that. But God even uses not only circumstances, but free choices of evil people if he knows to accomplish a greater good down the road. So that's why I'm not willing to just say, well, God just orchestrates these circumstances, and these circumstances necessarily exclude possibilities off the table. No, part of the divine ordering comes in the free choices of the creatures, where other choices were available to them. That's why they're morally responsible. The point is that given circumstance S, the person had the capability to choose the good option. It's just that in certain circumstances they wouldn't, but that's their free choice. It's not, say, determined by God.
And so this is where this is one thing I talked about later on, where the agent, and I know you would agree with this, the agent has no power over actualizing the situation that they were in. And so
I don't agree.
You don't agree? You don't think they have a power to actualize the situation that they're in?
Well, no, it depends on what you were. I mean, that's why I like the language of Joshua Asmussen here, where he says we're co-authors in God's story. So there's two big elements to this. So I can freely choose to actualize, say, through my choices, a situation where I'll be, say, among a terrible group of people where I'm likely to get into trouble and maybe end up in jail. Or I can make choices that actualize a different situation where I'm among better people who say we go to different countries and feed poor kids, right? Like, I can freely actualize that. Now, if you want to go all the way back to the divine decree, God determined to create a world in which I would freely choose to actualize those circumstances. But so I think we're co-authors in that sense. God determines to create the world where I would freely actualize circumstances, but then I still get to freely actualize circumstances.
Yeah, but like I said, well, and I think it is relevant that you go back to the divine decree, because, I mean, you agree that God has actualized all situations. And for me, when you say that God has actualized all situations, it's like saying that, it's like thinking about, well, so I watched the movie Dinosaur recently, so I'm thinking about this with dinosaurs for some reason. But imagine a really narrow valley with like a dinosaur walking in between. This is a really weird analogy officially, but that's just when I thought of a valley, that was the first thing I thought of. And so to me, Molinism is like saying that this dinosaur can freely choose to walk down this valley, but it really can't get out of the valley. Of course it's its free choice to walk through the valley and go through it, but it didn't have a choice to be in the valley that it's in. And so, yes, I agree. Ultimately, its choices are still free, but there was also a powerful element where they didn't really have a choice over a lot of those things.
Well, okay, so two main things is on Molinism, it wouldn't be the case. What you're describing, your analogy would be analogous to Calvinism, where ultimately there's only one thing the person can choose, and so they feel like they're freely choosing it, but really it's not up to them. On Molinism, there would be an alley that splits off into multiple things, and then even those multiple paths split into multiple paths, and then maybe the dinosaur doesn't even have to enter the valley in the first place. Maybe it can turn around and go the other direction, not enter the valley. The relevant point is, yes, God decrees to create a world in which he knows which valleys the dinosaur will freely choose to walk down.
Sorry,
but,
I made the analogy, but when I hear it, it just makes me laugh.
No, that's okay. But to me, the ever so relevant point is that God does not determine the circumstances and determined to create the world apart from the free choices of the creatures. And that's super important. So you can say, okay, God's like, okay, I'm going to create these free creatures, but I'm really going to negate all their choices by placing them into these circumstances. No, part of the deciding factor into what circumstances to create. Because think about it, if that was the case, if God was essentially going to negate all the free choices by just placing them in circumstances, then he would just place everybody in circumstances where they all chose the good things and all chose to be freely saved. That right there, the fact that he didn't do that is proof that God can't just say necessitate certain outcomes by certain circumstances. So what he does is he creates circumstances that essentially, well, if we know from scripture that God desires all to be saved and all aren't saved, means that God could not have just put everybody in circumstances where they all freely chose salvation. And it could be the case that no matter what, that there are multiple circumstances that he could have placed the unbeliever in, and in all of them, he would have freely chosen to reject salvation. So it's not even as you can say, well, the one circumstance he ended up in, that's why it's ultimately God's fault, because it could be there are multiple, and God said, okay, you know what, if you're going to be stubborn and just not choose salvation, then I'm at least going to orchestrate the circumstances that other goods can arise in this world. I don't know if there's a lot of going on there. My thoughts are kind of
so actually kind of, now that we're getting into soteriological issues, I kind of want to get on to my next big objection, but I will say this one last thing. So you keep using this language of the agent could have done otherwise, and I think, and I don't mean this rudely to you personally or to Molinists in general, but because I think it actually works, but there's this little pinhole every time that I hear from Molinists of this pedantic distinction between could have and will. And I think, like I said, I do think it works, but it is interesting to me just how thinly of a razor line Molinism walks from being divine determinism versus being creaturely free actions. But
but it really matters, because on divine determinism, you could not have done otherwise. So that to me, that's it's all the relevant distinction between do entirely external factors determine your choice, or do at least some internal factors determine your choice, whereas external factors can heavily influence them.
Yeah, and so here's my thing. So you say that I could have chosen otherwise, but here's one of the sentences that I said is that if you want to say that person P could choose otherwise, then it seems to me that you have to say that in S, P can choose A or not A. And so what I don't understand, and I think this goes back a little bit to my problems with the truth value of counterfactuals, but it seems weird to me to say the libertarianly free creature could choose otherwise, or that he won't choose otherwise in a given situation. But you're saying that he could choose otherwise, but I just don't know what that means, because he never will. And so what's the relevant difference of he never will versus he cannot? I just don't see the relevant difference there.
Well, it's that he won't freely choose to act on something he had the ability to choose. Yeah. Whereas in another circumstance, he had to choose this because he could not. He did not have the ability to choose otherwise.
Yeah, so, but what do you mean when you say that he could have done otherwise? Well, and I guess that gets into a little bit of your distinction of
A couple
multiple
things.
choices
A couple
compatible
things.
with his nature.
It was compatible with his nature to choose otherwise. That's first. So therefore, if it's compatible with his nature, it was possible for him to choose otherwise. And depending on the circumstance, you may have said, and again, this will go back to the scripture. If he was morally obligated to choose otherwise, then, like, if God is commanding someone to choose otherwise, that means they have a real ability to do it and should do it. And so the fact that maybe some do and maybe some don't, and maybe we could even point to real life examples where we know, say, of multiple friends who grew up in the same circumstances, and one of them rose out of the circumstances and made something of themselves, whereas the others didn't. That's a good example of.
Well, but there's really none of that on Molinism, though, because there's no rising above your circumstances on Molinism, to me, because you're just doing this one free thing, and so there's no.
You are.
Yeah, but there's.
I mean, if you're freely actualizing a better set of circumstances.
Yeah, I'm just saying that there's no doing not A on Molinism. You will only do A, and to me, that just seems like, I don't know.
Well, no, God.
But your distinction.
I don't think you need that. I don't think you need the phrase "he will only do A," because then I would agree that almost sounds like he's being forced. I mean, I think there are certain maybe instances we could point to where maybe someone was so heavily influenced or had it that they would only ever choose this one thing. Like maybe they're an addict and they only would ever choose to continue to engage. But there's certainly other circumstances where maybe it wasn't that strong. Nevertheless, God, being omniscient, knew which one he would freely do. And it didn't have to be that he will do it unless what you want to talk I mean, that might be a relevant distinction if you're talking about going from a possible world to an actual world, going from would to will. But even the will is merely describing just the choice that the free creature does make, or what God knows that they will make. And it doesn't mean that it was so strong that it essentially ruled out other possibilities.
And I think actually that your distinction of something being free if there's more than one choice compatible with your nature is actually really useful, and I'm not sure that it does, but I think it might negate this objection. But anyhow, while we're kind of moving on from that anyway, I kind of want to get.
Can I ask you? Did you finish this? Well, because I know originally you read all the premises, and then we started going back through them. Did we just? I think
we dealt with most of the relevant points on that. So,
okay, because I knew there were certain ones at the end I disagreed with, but if we already dealt with them, it's fine.
Let me check. Yeah. Okay, I think we dealt with everything. So the last one that I have is actually, I put it in premise conclusion form, is called the Universalism Objection. And so I'm going to read that off to you and articulate that to you. So premise one, there are non-actual persons, and out of character, when I use the phrase non-actual persons, I'm using a bit of the Aristotelian metaphysics of possible versus actual things, but I'm not held to that point of view. But just that's what I'm talking about when I say non-actual persons. There are persons that are possible that have not been actualized. So premise one, there are non-actual persons. Premise two, if there are non-actual persons, then God chose not to actualize all possible people. Premise three, God wants all to be saved. Premise four, if God has middle knowledge, God knows who will freely choose to accept him. Premise five, if God wants all to be saved, God would actualize a world exclusively of those who freely choose to be saved. Premise six, all do not freely choose to be saved. Conclusion one, therefore God did not actualize a world exclusively of those who freely choose to be saved. Premise seven, if Molinism is true, God could have chosen a world in which all freely choose to be saved, which I think is a restatement of another premise. Premise 8, God did not choose such a world. Premise 9, if God did not actualize a world exclusively of those who choose to be saved, then either God does not want all to be saved or does not have middle knowledge. Conclusion 2, per premise 3, therefore God does not have middle knowledge. So I saw you trying to write some of that down, and I can be happy.
I didn't get past the first premise. I was going to ask, if that's in front of you, is it convenient for you to copy and paste that in Messenger and send that to me real quick? Because that would really benefit me. Yeah.
It's a long syllogism. I apologize. I'm like Ed Phaser with my syllogisms. Like, I just want to flesh out all of my stuff really, really clearly.
Yeah, and I know that's good. You absolutely should do that.
All right, there you go. That should be sent to you.
Okay.
Oh, dang it! It didn't double space at all. So my bad.
Oh, it didn't
I'm on my computer, and my messenger is on my iPad, and so I have two different files that I'm working with right now. So.
All right, it has not come through as of yet.
So it should be in the private chat on StreamYard.
Oh, StreamYard. Okay, that's even easier. Okay, cool.
You're good.
I was looking for it on Messenger on Facebook.
Yeah,
okay,
cool.
Okay. this works. Okay, so premise one: there are non-actual persons. This might not be super relevant to us. I might disagree with the metaphysics of that statement. I don't think like there are these Platonic souls kind of exist floating out there, and God just didn't.
That's why I kind of want to separate myself from. There's some entailments of that are very strictly Aristotelian metaphysics, and what I'm trying to get at is that there's just essences of people that are possible people that God just did not choose to actualize. So that's all I mean by that premise.
Sure, and yeah, okay, so sure, that's fine. So if there are non-actual persons, then God chose not to actualize all people. I mean, I would just say again.
Of one, I think.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm personally a little fuzzed. I don't like the language of that.
Yeah,
and I don't mean that in like a derogatory.
Oh no, I've just been looking into Aristotelian stuff recently, so it's kind of in my head, so it bleeds out into my language, whether I like it to or not. So
I would just say that God could have chose, for example, I don't plan to ever have kids one day, and so God chose to actualize a world in which, there might be another possible world in which I do have kids, and so in a sense that might be what you're getting at, is there's a possible world which certain people could have existed but didn't exist in the actual world. So
I get sort of like that.
Premise 3, God wants all to be saved. Now, of course, this is a huge distinction because there's no reason to think when you're reading scripture that when it says God wants all to be saved, we know he's talking about all people that exist, but there's no reason to think he'd be referring to anybody outside of all
and so
exist.
This is why I need to specify a little bit more. This is a rough syllogism. So just to flesh out some of the ideas that I'm talking about here, we would agree that God is talking about all people that he actualizes or that have been actualized. God wants all of those people to be saved. So for the context of that premise, that's all I'm talking about. That in whatever world God chooses to actualize with people, he wants all of those people to be saved. So that's so I didn't flesh that out as well as I wanted to, but that's where I was kind of going.
Okay, I'm perfectly happy with that. Okay. Yeah. So premise 4, if God has middle knowledge, God knows who will freely choose to accept him. Of course. Premise 5, if God wants all to be saved, God would actualize the world exclusively of those who freely choose to be saved. I would strongly disagree with that premise. And I would say, because it certainly seems that God, if such a world could, well, hold on, let me reread that. If God wants all to be saved, God would actualize the world exclusively of those who freely choose to be saved. That depends because, of course, we can easily conceptualize with certain people who say become pastors who in their lineage, as the example Frank Turek gives, where there's atheists in their ancestry. And so, of course, if God couldn't necessarily actualize that person unless he first actualized an ancestor who true. So I don't think it would be feasible for God to actualize the world. Or you might say, God could have created, but it could be, again, when we get to Molinism circumstances, that if you say, well, maybe this person is born prior to, now, of course, then if you get into like John Dunphy's hypermoralic dualism, then maybe that person just wouldn't even be the same person. So it wouldn't be relevant if they were born like in another body prior. But also could it be that in different circumstances, that person doesn't freely choose to be saved or maybe never hears the gospel, or, you can conceive of a lot of
things like that. So this is where I want to dig in a little bit to some of the entailments of premises 1 and 2. And so some of the entailments, I think, are this, are that there are people that would have freely chosen to be saved, that God chose not to actualize. And so this gets into a bit of possible world semantics. This is not my modal objection, but a bit of thinking about God and the kinds of worlds that he chooses to actualize. So at least from my metaphysical point of view, there's a class of worlds that I would consider being the greatest possible worlds or very great worlds. I'm not decided if I believe that greatest possible worlds is a coherent notion, but at least currently.
I like what the nuance Trent Doherty provides. Trent Doherty says, I'm not sure that there is one greatest possible world, but I do think there are the greatest of all kinds of possible worlds.
And that's kind of the camp that I'm in. And so when we're getting into that, we're saying, when we say that there are non-actual people, I don't think that entails, but I think that it implies that there are people that God could have actualized who would have freely chosen to accept him, that he chose not to actualize. And I think, and so if you agree with that, then we kind of have to get down to, all right, so God chose to actualize a certain number of free people who would choose to be saved. But we agreed in premise 3 that God wants all people that he actualizes to be saved. So let's say in concept,
once they're actualized, yes, he wants all of those people to be saved.
So let's say that in concept, so this is almost going it from a Bayesian kind of point of view, to say if this kind of concept is true, which obviously I think I ultimately reject this premise because I reject middle knowledge and there's some other problems that I have with it, but I think the Molinists should accept it. But anyhow, let's say that there's a world that God could make with one person, where let's go to the middle number, where one person, only person who has ever actualized, and he freely chooses to be saved. And then let's go up a little bit, and let's just say it seems reasonable, it seems plausible at least, to say that there's a limit between one person and the amount of people that God chose to actualize, where 100% of the people that God chose to actualize would freely choose to be saved. Now, that may be a ridiculously small number of people, but it seems to me at least plausible that such a thing does exist. And so that's where I'm kind of getting into in premise 4, is that God knows anyone who will freely choose to accept him. And if he wants all people once actualized to be saved, it seems to me that God would instantiate a world, even if that had a really small amount of people, a numerical number of less people who would be saved, that the quality, I guess, the percentile quality of that would be something that would be preferable to God because of his overarching want that all people would freely come to choose him.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things there. I hope I can.
Yeah, you're good. I'm sorry, I ramble on a little bit sometimes.
No, that's okay. So I agree with Tim Stratton here that when we talk about, for example, God's choice to create any world at all, that God certainly had libertarian free choice to make that choice, that God had two options that, in my opinion, are equally good. He could have remained timelessly eternal in the perfect love of the Trinity, and that would have been an equal good to God choosing to create a world to share that love out of his generosity and his love with free creatures. And so even if God creates a world with one person and chooses to share that love with that one person, then that's a very gracious gift. That's a generous gift that God gives that one person. It seems though that God certainly wanted many more people. And when we get into best of all kinds of possible worlds, it seems, I think God probably created the world in which the maximum number of people would freely choose to embrace him in salvation, while probably keeping in mind, hopefully, the minimum number that would freely choose to reject him.
And I think, I'm sorry, you're good.
No, and it's just, it doesn't seem feasible to me to think that, well, I certainly don't see, because of percentage-wise, why it would at all be preferable for God to create a world of, say, 3 people, even if it would be 100%, versus, say, billions of people who freely choose to embrace him, just because it's a smaller percentage. That just doesn't seem intuitively preferable to God for me.
I think that the best, and this is just me critiquing my own argument, I think the best opportunity that the Molinist has to escape the conclusion of this argument is either to reject premise 3 in a form, to reject that that's the overarching goal of God, and to say that there's another goal, like maybe God wants to instantiate a certain quality of good that will come about, or what you were saying, like there's a maximum number of people saved with the minimal number of people sent to hell, something like that. I think that type of thing is your best bet in escaping an argument like this.
I don't think so, because, and I'm not saying this to be insulting, I think multiple of the premises are untrue, and so I think there's multiple outs. I think again, premises 1 and 2 I think are highly controversial in themselves, because that gets into a huge debate about like ontology of non-existing things, even if we could speak of such a thing. Which again, I'm a non-realist, so I don't even think there are mathematical objects or logical truths. I don't think they exist. I think they're necessary truths because they describe ultimate reality, which lies in God. But so then and then again, premise 3, God wants all to be saved. I can't remember how you just recently phrased it, but I seriously disagreed, because you said premise 3, the way you said, well, if we say that this is God's goal, immediately I disagree. What Scripture says is that's God's will. It doesn't say that's his goal, because clearly God recognizes that what his will is can't be accomplished. So what he did was he set out a new goal, that he would provide a means of salvation for others who would freely embrace him. And the people who choose not to reject him, they have nobody to blame but themselves. It's their fault that they don't get to enjoy God's gracious gift of fellowship with him. And then so when we get into God, premise 5, if God wants all to be saved, God would actualize the world exclusively to those who are freely saved. Again, I don't think a world like that is feasible, unless, again, you're talking about something like 1 or 3 people. And I just don't see any reason to think that would be preferable to a world where God can have billions of people freely choose, even though there's the tragedy of those who reject him. But again, so long as God gives them libertarian freedom, if he gives them sufficient evidence for his existence, he gives them sufficient grace so that they can be saved, then the tragedy falls solely on their blame. And this is one of those things where when we're pushing the challenge to the Molinists, I think there are many answers, but at the end of the day, how much worse is it for the Calvinist? For the Calvinist, not only does God, and this is something I learned from Leighton Flowers, not only is God holding people responsible and condemning them to hell for a nature that they could not control, and I know the Calvinist likes to get into, well, God doesn't owe anyone salvation, but of course that assumes that they're morally culpable for the wrong thing, and therefore he doesn't owe people who are morally culpable for the wrong thing salvation. But of course, they're not morally culpable in my view, because he gave them a nature. But it's even worse than that. Leighton Flowers points out that many Calvinists have said that God's choice of election predates his act of creation. So it's not even that God creates creatures, gives them the corrupt nature, and then holds them morally accountable for doing the wrong things, but rather he created them from the beginning to become sinful and to ultimately be destined for hell. So even if there might be some places in my view where I can't fully answer, I would certainly say it's much more preferable to that sort of a world. And I know you're not a Calvinist. I know when you talk about simple foreknowledge, to me, my main objection to simple foreknowledge is it grants, say, divine omniscience, but doesn't grant divine omnipotence, because then it kind of puts a limit on the worlds God could create with respect to divinely decreeing things. All do not freely choose to be saved. Yes, their conclusion, therefore, God does not actualize the world exclusively of those. And again, I agree. I just because I don't think it's reasonable. And then, if Molinism is true, God could have chosen a world in which all freely choose to be saved. Yes, true. But again, if it's a less preferable one to him, then so
he's not that's obligated. Where all of it, like I said, comes down to premise 3 in the original argument of whether or not you think the fact that God wants all to be saved is his overarching goal in what he's doing. And I think from what I'm hearing is that you reject that. You would say that there's other overarching goods over his will and his want for people to be saved. And I think in principle, I agree with you.
It's not that so here's, in a sense, I'd be careful. I agree with it. I agree with what you just said, but I'd be careful in the way I'd phrase it. It's not that God doesn't, like when we say it's God's will that all will be saved, but he has these overarching goals. I'm not saying it's that it would be better if, say, a lesser number of people freely chose God, but it would be better. It would be better if a smaller number of people freely enter heaven, but it's because of their genuine choice to genuinely love God. That is better than, say, unanimous an amount of people who are more so determined to embrace God.
Yep. Fair enough.
Just to finish it off, premise 8, God did not choose such a world. Agreed. Premise 9, if God did not actualize the world exclusive of those who freely choose to be saved, then either God does not want all to be saved. Again, God
that's just want them to be saved. Premises, so.
Yeah, and I would just say, based on what I've said before, I don't think it necessarily does follow when we say, or he does not have middle knowledge. Yeah, the middle, maybe we could get onto the middle knowledge thing, because that to me just seems to be a necessary entailment of omniscience, but maybe you could tell me why I'm wrong there.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that you would place, well, because middle knowledge is just a subsect of, to the Molinist, it's just a subsect of natural knowledge. I'm just saying, instead of placing those counterfactuals in his natural knowledge, I'm putting it in his free knowledge.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we were discussing earlier.
I know I've been doing a lot of talking, so I'll say this one last thing. I wanted to do this early because we were talking about this, and I think I may have misspoken a couple of times, and probably people who know what they're talking about here, like Tim Stratton, were probably kicking himself when I was saying certain things. So I just wanted to read these definitions real quick so they're just out there, and that way people can know what the source is, and if I misspeak, that's on me. Real quick, natural knowledge is God's pre-volitional knowledge of all necessary truths, including all possibilities, i.e. all possible worlds. God's middle knowledge, God's pre-volitional knowledge of all counterfactual truths of what would happen under any possible set of circumstances, including counterfactuals of creaturely freedom and of random events like quantum indeterminacy, i.e. all feasible worlds. And then free knowledge is God's post-volitional knowledge of all contingent truths about the world he has chosen to actualize, including its past, present, and future, i.e. the actual world. So sorry, I just wanted to read those so that they're out there, and if I misrefer, people know what the actual thing is and not just to rely on me because I misspeak.
Yep, no problem. So that generally gets most of my objections and stuff out of the way. I think I still think some of them are the case, but I think you have good responses to them, and I appreciate that. So real quick, so there's a couple of things I guess that we could talk about, and I'll let you sort of pick between these. One is the thing that we were discussing earlier about, so you don't think that, or I don't think that theological determinism is a problem for rationality, and you do. Or we can just have the discussion about my modality objection. So I'm fine with whichever one of those you want to talk about. I'm totally willing and able to discuss either of those.
Well, the prior one might be slightly shorter. The one about the exhaustive defined determinism excluding rationality, because I do hold. Here's the thing: is I could be wrong, and so maybe that might be more interesting to explore. Because if I'm wrong, I'll be happy to concede it.
Yeah. So actually, so let's go ahead and just do the rationality one. So. What I would be interested in, and I just mostly want you to restate for the audience, because I think I have some idea of why you think this is the case, but of why it is that you think that on divine determinism it is the case that humans cannot claim to be rational. Because I totally agree with you, naturalism, there's no hope. But so. Yeah,
so the idea of rational inference, I'm going to maybe butcher some of these definitions here, but generally how we think of it is I have the ability to reason, to think through, say, like you and I have been doing, been going through premises and thinking, is this one true? Is that one true? Does this conclusion follow? Trying to, in our general life, figure out what truth is, trying to figure out all these things. That's generally the process of rationality. And of course, we have to be free to actually choose between true conclusions and false conclusions. If we are not free to choose between true conclusions and false conclusions, then I don't think we can claim to be rational in our reasoning. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't say accidentally guess true conclusions, but I think generally most people agree that even if you just guessed the true conclusion, you weren't rational in affirming it, even though you held the true conclusion, because you just guessed. You didn't use any reasoning process to get there. So what it ultimately boils down for me is the source of thing. I'm not going to argue, because this might be, and I don't know where you're going to object. I feel this might be where you object, is that what I'm assuming is something like the principle of alternative possibilities. And so I need the principle of alternative possibilities to say, well, I could have chosen the false conclusion. I could have chosen the true conclusion. Again, I do think that is true. I do hold to that. But I think when we get to the sourcehood definition of libertarian freedom, whereas I am the source of the choice, as long as I am ultimately the source of choosing the true conclusion over the false conclusion, then I was rational in affirming it, because I was the source who looked at the premises, decided what I thought was most plausible, and chose what I thought seemed to be the truth. And the reason that kind of definition matters is because it seems to me what the Calvinist might want to say is something like, well, sure, it wasn't possible for me to choose the false conclusion or the true one, because I only had, say, one choice. but I was still the source in some kind of weird sense of choosing the true one. But again, going back to the distinctions, if all of those things were ultimately externally derived from given nature by God, then I wasn't the source. And if I'm not the source, I don't think I can be rational. I think if God gives me a nature and that nature can only choose one conclusion, whether it be true or false, we ultimately can't be rational in that sense. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't hear you. Did you mute yourself?
Yep. So, you know, at least at this point, I'm not a Calvinist, much to our mutual friend
I know you're not.
dismay. But yeah, so and so just in defense of the Calvinist, I feel like in this situation could say something like this. I don't know if this would entail accepting an epistemological stance like externalism, but which would be that, you know, rational conclusions are reached through a process or something like that. David Paulman's probably going to watch this video and kill me for misdefining it because he hates its externalism. But anyhow, so something like that. And so you could almost accept something like that and say, well, think about it. God has given natures to people where certain people freely choose to accept him. And so those who are Christians are those that God has freely chosen in that regard. And so God can...
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Did you say the Calvinists would say that? I'm going to misheard you.
I keep using the word freely. I'm sorry. I'm used to...
Okay, because Calvinists might get you for that one.
Yeah. I'm just used to talking about Molinism conversation, so I always have to put in freely. But anyhow, and so anyhow, on Calvinism, I feel like you could just say, well, for those of us that are Christians, that God has selected, given natures to, that are Christians, then God has just blessed us and honored us with the ability to come to true conclusions about things. And so almost in a way that for those, and like I said, I don't know how this would work for a naturalist or someone who's not a Christian on Calvinism, but I don't really think that's important, because the claim someone like Tim Stratton would make is if you believe in divine determinism, that you can't be rational in your conclusions. And I feel like the Calvinists could just as easily say, well, God was the rational process that determined me to come to the right conclusion. So God put me through the process of coming to a rational conclusion. And so there, I don't think that something like the principle of alternative possibilities is necessary for them to claim that they came to their conclusions rationally. Because in the same way that they wouldn't claim to have come to their salvation by themselves, they would probably still say something like, well, I didn't come to a rational conclusion by myself, but God determined me and put me in a thing where I came to that conclusion. And so it's a rational and true conclusion. And so that would be where I would feel like the Calvinist at least has some grounds on which to say, I can claim to be rational because God is giving me the ability to be rational.
Yeah, I think he could claim God is rational. I don't think he could claim he is rational. And so here's a couple things. So first is it does depend, I'll admit, on what kind of Calvinism you're talking about. Like if you're talking about, like you said, exhaustive defined determinism, where everything's determined, all the choices, everything all the way down to the middle. Now, some friends of mine who are Calvinists, and I think Greg Kokel would fall into this, whereas we actually can make certain free choices with certain mundane choices, like with the ice cream. God doesn't say like exhaustively determined that I will choose vanilla. He does allow me to actually choose between vanilla and chocolate. Rather, those kinds of Calvinists would say, though God does determine salvation, that salvation is ultimately determined by God. And so, for example, irresistible grace would still apply in those circumstances where God does determine to irresistibly change someone to now want to serve him, and they can't choose otherwise. So I would say that kind of Calvinist could certainly say that, okay, there's a degree of rationality that we have for certain choices. And now salvation would be a whole other issue. Now, I would still have my moral objections there. And then you could still have some kind of objections. Well, are they free to choose that? And that might, but I would say certainly for the exhaustive determinist, that where God determines everything, I don't even know if it necessarily makes sense to just say that God gives us, say, this ability to rationalize and reason, no
Yeah.
more than it would for the naturalists. I've heard some naturalists argue, well, we just evolved the ability to reason. I say, yeah, but even every step along the process isn't up to you. And I would say, even if we're talking about, say, God walking someone through the process of reason to come to a conclusion, every single step is divinely determined by God. If I determine this premise to be true, God determined I would think that. And if I think this premise is false, God determined I would think that. And so if God determines every single step, I don't know that we can claim to be rational in that sense. Certainly not the way where we rationally affirm things.
And so in the way of someone who loves being pedantic because I love being pedantic, what I would say is that I don't think the exhaustive divine determinist can claim that can make the statement, I was rational with relationship to my choice to believe X, in the exact same way that they can't say I was the one that had faith or whatever in relationship to their salvation. But they can claim to have reached a rational conclusion in the fact of saying, not that I reached this rational conclusion, but that this is a rational belief because God allowed those who are a part of his body to come to these true conclusions rationally. So that would be the regard that I think that at least the Calvinists could say something like that.
So I think that's a much more fair response. I still don't think it holds, because I think if you can't claim to be rational through the process, I certainly don't think you can just jump to the end and claim to be rational there, especially when you consider that on at least a hyper-Calvinist worldview, people like me was determined by God to come to the incorrect position on the issue of Calvinism and Molinism. God ultimately determined I would come to the wrong conclusion here. And that his determining of that is just the same as his determining of the Calvinists to come to their conclusion that Calvinism is true. And then once they affirm that, then even there are a range of views within Calvinism that how can they say, well, within this range, I came to the right one in this. They couldn't know, because God determines even many Christians to believe wrong things. According to their worldview.
And I agree that is a problem to me. That is another friend of mine that he's sort of on the borderline between Molinism and Calvinism. That's kind of his thing. He's like, I just don't get how why there would be disunity among the church. And I'm sure Calvinists have answers to those sorts of things to make no comment as to whether or not they're good. But I think my stipulation is not necessarily that exhaustively the exhaustive divine determinist could declare I am rational in relationship to all decisions, but merely think of this as Tim Stratton is making a logical problem of rationality for the Calvinist, and the Calvinist is just saying it's not a logical problem anymore because I'm presenting a situation where I could be considered to have come to my belief rationally, or that my belief in this is rational. And so, so you could still reformulate it in an evidential sense to say, well, there's a lot of these choices that still don't seem like you could make that claim for. But for me, in the place of the Calvinist, I'm just making the claim that you can't say that it's completely out the window.
So we might be able to find some common ground here. So I think what the Calvinists could say is they could say, given the truth of Christianity and Calvinism on their worldview, that it's a rational conclusion in and of itself, and God is rational, and God is the standard of rationality. So this true belief is the correct one, and so there's that. And then they could say secondarily that maybe you could affirm that it's even this might be a little tough to get past the language of. You could say it's rational to believe what God irresistibly forces you to believe. If irresistible grace is true,
that would be where I would go. Yeah.
And there's that. But even then, and this is where I will hold to my guns here, you still cannot rationally affirm it, because if you don't possess the ability to be rational and reason through things, then you can believe ontologically God exists and it's rational for me to believe that. But if you don't possess the ability of rational, you can't rationally affirm, you can't evaluate whether or not it would be reasonable to believe what irresistible grace tells you should believe. So I would still say that's a big problem.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So I think, so I think that's well enough done on that. So how much longer you want to go with this? Because
it's up to you. We probably shouldn't go too much longer, just because I'm going to stay on for a relatively long
amount of time. I just don't want to take too much time away
I
from
mean,
you, depending on.
here's the thing. I can actually stay up for another hour. I do get, when videos go over 2 hours, I do start feeling maybe future people won't watch them as much because they might just feel like, oh, that's long. I'm not going to sit down for the whole thing. But I am quite interested in your modality objection, so maybe we could do that as kind of the last thing.
All right. So all right, cool. So this is not necessarily a formal objection that I'm bringing, just something I'm kind of playing with that may or may not be an objection.
Sure.
So this came up when I was watching a lecture from Brian Leftow. He's a theistic philosopher. I think he's at Oxford and Notre Dame. I think he's been at both at one time. And he was bringing an argument from possibilities. And so this is all about I'll parody Sam Harris and say this is the modal landscape instead of the moral landscape. And so Brian Leftow said this. So he's saying this: in the context of modality, we need to be realists about possibility, particularly about unrealized possibility. And we should also believe in these maximally sized unrealized possibilities, the type of things we call possible worlds. That is to say, we should accept that there are mind-independent truths about unrealized possibilities. And actually, interestingly enough, I'm not sure if this would affect you, given that no, because that's about abstract objects. So
yeah, I mean, I will say, and I really don't, I want to interrupt you and cut you off, but anytime that language is used, I just remain skeptical. When we say there are truths of unpossible worlds, I don't think there's any ontological reality to that. So I can't commit myself to that, or I can't agree with that. Now, if we want to say that God has, this is why I believe in middle knowledge, God has knowledge of what would have been the case had he actualized a different world, I'll go with that. But I wouldn't agree that there's this Platonic truth about these worlds.
This is less of a discussion of the kind of knowledge that God has of possible worlds, and more of a question of humans and how they conceptualize of possible worlds and possible world semantics.
Okay. So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You can continue.
No, fair enough. So anyhow, if we are realists about possibility, then we need an ontology for that those concepts of possibility. So what we need to know what sorts of entities in the world go into making true possibility claims true. And so he goes into a little bit of how we select an ontology. And Leftow's point is basically he sort of compares two hypotheses. One is called restrictive naturalism, which he thinks is the best ontology for the naturalist to take when it comes to possible worlds. And he basically says, look, the kind of ontology here is way too limited. The type of things that we conceive up as being possible, I mean, you understand the language of possible worlds. You kind of have necessary truths up here, impossible truth down here, and in the middle is all this weird stuff that's logically possible, but it's not necessarily true, or it's not necessarily actual. And so Leftow's like, well, here's the thing. We have this whole range in here of all these possible things that if we follow the ontology of restrictive naturalism, it's not going to work. That does not cover, that restricts us to this tiny portion of claims, ontologically speaking. And he uses that in his argument for God. He's like, well, what would give us that? Well, all-knowing, all-powerful. He does this sort of thing, and I'm butchering the argument. But anyhow, that's what he goes with. But the point of the argument that I want to extract from this is I want to get this idea that when we're talking about our ontology for possible worlds, we want to make sure that it's something that reflects what Leftow calls like armchair philosophy, right? And so when he's talking about possible worlds, he's like, you can get really complicated into what it means for something to be a possible world. But really, when it gets down to it, like anything that we could think of in possible world semantics is just stuff you can think of when you're just sitting on your armchair, like or sitting in your armchair just thinking about things, like all this stuff about unicorns and giant flying spaghetti monsters and all this stuff is just stuff that you can think of from your armchair. And so we want an ontology to ground that. So my objection to Molinism from that is essentially as follows. And so when we're talking about thinking about possible worlds, we're thinking about different types of creatures, different types of actions, that type of thing. And so obviously, left out, I think, exposes, if he's right, he exposes a huge problem for the naturalist ontology for that sort of things, or for that sort of thing, which is this enormous gap. For Molinism, it would be a smaller gap, and so this is why I didn't really bring it as a formal objection. I'm not sure how big of an issue if it is, if my argument is sound, or the concepts that I'm working with. But when we're talking about possibility claims and counterfactuals, let's say, let's give you the case of your orange versus your red iPhone. So you're making the claim that in the situation where you have the option to pick an orange iPhone, you'll always pick an orange iPhone over a red iPhone. But when we think about you in that particular situation, it seems possible, it seems like there's a possible world where you just freely choose the red iPhone. And so it seems like if we accept Molinism as part of our ontology, because essentially what we'd be doing here is this: we'd be taking a theistic ontology, the type that Leftow is talking about, and we're kind of looking at two different species of it. We're looking at the species of Molinism, middle knowledge, that type of thing, and then just another species. And so we can debate what that species is, but you know, they're just another species. And for me, if you are accepting that there are these strongly true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, that it seems like that doesn't ground our ontology of possible worlds properly. And to me, that's, like I said, that the more I think about that, that's not a huge objection, but it is somewhat of an objection because it doesn't seem like it grounds our understanding of possible worlds in a meaningful way. So, like I said, I'm not bringing that as a formal objection. I just kind of want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. So again, it depends. Like, what do we mean by ontology of possible worlds? Is it need to be grounded? And I know I use Platonism. I'm not obviously trying to insinuate you're a Platonist or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's just the easy kind of way to say it, so most people know what I'm talking about. But like, I don't necessarily know that there even has to be an ontology of possible worlds. I mean, again, my definition of possible worlds, I always usually clarify this for people. I know you already know, but I usually clarify for people that we're not talking about the multiverse, right? Or like these other universes that actually exist. We're just talking about ways the world could have been. For example, God could have created a world in which Adam and Eve chose not to sin. And then maybe everybody would have been born into God's blissful. I mean, going back, so there's a possible world. That's just ways that sorry, I messed that up because I got distracted.
No, you're good. You're good.
Ways the world could have been, and so I don't necessarily know that there even needs to be an ontology that grounds that beyond just God's middle knowledge of God, just knowing how the world would have been had he actualized a different world, or had he actualized a different set of circumstances, or had he, as David Silverman likes to say, put the tree of knowledge of good and evil over here and not over here. I think to me, it's just sufficient to say God knows what would have been the case under different circumstances, but none of them are the case.
Yeah, and so, sorry, I'm typing in something.
No, you're okay.
Yeah, and so when we're thinking about an ontology for possible worlds, and this is where I feel like you as an anti-realist might, and I don't know where I am on that yet. I've kind of debated it. I want to look at Craig's arguments for anti-realism because I do have an inclination towards conceptualism of some kind.
His book God Overall, the best nonfiction book I've read, and it just came out in paperback version, so it's a lot cheaper. So I would highly recommend that.
That's good. Philosophy books are so expensive.
Yeah, especially when they're like pieces for like real prestigious universities.
Yeah, and so when we're thinking about God and possible worlds, we're thinking about things that that are grounded in the knowledge of God in the same way, or grounded in the nature of God. Well, I'm trying to use language that people won't hate me for using, but I think you understand the concept that I'm talking about. In the same way,
I don't know that we need it, but go ahead.
Yeah, and so well, because remember, this is not so much a thing for God necessarily as such, but something for humans. But anyhow, if we're gonna ground a lot of our concepts of possible worlds, what type of framework, what type of ontology works best for that, I think it makes sense to say, and I guess what the Molinists could also say is that there is a possible world that, I don't know. That's the thing, because I feel like if we're actually going along with me and talking about grounding ontologies in this sort of way, that the Molinist can't say that there's a possible world where you freely chose the red iPhone. I don't, and maybe they could, but I don't think that they could make a claim like that.
Could you restate that? I'm not sure I followed that completely.
Yeah,
I have the red iPhone, right? So
yeah,
that's
so
the
so
actual
you have
world.
the iPhone, but in the case that you could have chosen the orange iPhone. I was about to say blue. I don't know why. In case you could have chosen the orange iPhone. Like I said, so when we're thinking about possible worlds that could have possibly been, to me, it just totally seems like a possibility that that you could have freely chosen, given the option of the orange one, you could have freely chosen the red one. But there, I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything logically contradictory there. But yet, you would also, I mean, I feel like the Molinist has to say there is no such possible world where you freely choose the red one, because there is a counterfactual of creaturely freedom, which states that you will always choose the orange one. So
yeah, I just wouldn't agree. I mean, it's a simplistic example, but like I said, for example, let's say there is an orange one, but it's $200 more expensive. Okay, I'm not choosing the orange one. Like, there are multiple. So when counterfactuals, they get into like every single possible contributing factor and just what I would do considering those circumstances.
yeah, and so but I'm still talking about that in that sense that basically all other things being equal, there's nothing that seems to be logically contradictory about you. Because I agree, I mean, you could change the circumstances, but that I think would be to miss the point. The point is that there does seem to be a place, there does seem to be a way that you could just, think of a possible world where you just freely choose to do to pick the red iPhone instead of the orange one.
Sure.
So
yeah, and I agree. There's nothing logically contradictory about that.
Yeah,
right. Just saying I would do this or I would do that doesn't mean it's contradictory that I choose the opposite.
Yeah, but it just seems like if you're a Molinist, you'd have to say that in actuality there is no possible world where that exact circumstance S is instantiated, where you do freely choose to pick the red one, even though that seems like that should be a possible world that actually exists.
Yeah, so I'm gonna say something, and this might be completely off base and not at all what you're talking about.
You're good.
It might relate in kind. So when Tyler Vell was on my show, he came up with this idea, and at the time I just had no clue what to say to it. Now, and I know now how I'd respond to it. Basically, he said, "Okay, you have World 1 and World 2, and
yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
And so there's say a 1,000-year period between both of them, and the circumstances in both those are identical, right? And then at T1 in each of those worlds, World 1 and World 2, in World 1 you make one choice, and in World 2 you make the opposite choice. But everything prior to that was exactly identical. And he kind of proposed this dilemma of like, well, then what the heck is it that is grounding the choice here? And to me, it just, what I want to say is, well, if we say pick any world and the circumstances for the first 1,000 years are exactly what they are, that given all of those things, I just would make the one choice, and I just wouldn't, given those circumstances, I just would never choose the other thing. And so in that sense, you can say that there's no possible world in which I would freely, given these circumstances, I would freely, or I would not, I just would never freely choose to not do the thing. But that doesn't negate possibility, doesn't negate libertarian freedom, because of course it's negating counterfactuals, it's negating changing circumstances, it's negating the very thing it's trying to argue against in kind of a weird way. So yeah, I might be fine to say that there's no possible world in which, given these specific circumstances, I would freely choose not to do the thing. But that's the whole point to me.
Yeah, and so and that's just where I would say, well, there's a problem for your ontology. But then, well, early me thinking those thoughts is like, well, there's a problem for your ontology. The problem is that it doesn't, it seems that in that exact situation that you could have freely chosen red instead of orange.
Right.
and there just is no possible situation, so it doesn't, and there's nothing logically contradictory there, so it seems problematic. But like I said, that's where
because you're not just talking about is no possible situation, because we would agree if you change the counterfactuals, we're talking about giving a very specific one set of circumstances what will happen. And you might say there's not, and saying there's not a possible world is not the same thing as saying it's not possible for me to choose. Or
yeah.
I might have that wrong.
I think you're right. I'm just saying that this is back to Lefdow's concept of just the armchair philosophy, right? And so it seems like there's a reflection here of, I can just, freely think, or I can just think of you freely choosing either red or orange, nothing logically contradictory there. So it doesn't seem like Molinism grounds that. But like I said,
I think what grounds the ontology is God's decree to create this universe in which I would freely choose the one I choose.
Yeah, and so like I said, I think that I do. This is the statement I will make. I do think it is true that it is a problem for Molinism. However, early on, I thought it was a big problem, and now I think it's just kind of a small problem. But it does seem like somewhat of a problem because it's in specific circumstances. And so that's sorry, I kind of missed the last thing that you said, but I was just thinking, I was trying to get that statement out of just saying, I think it is a problem. I just think it's a small problem now versus earlier when I thought that it was a larger objection to the concept as a whole.
Yeah, and I would just say what grounds the choice is God's creative decree to create the world, to elect to create the world that he did. That just is what grounds it. And when we're talking about possible worlds, we're just talking about things that could have been but aren't the case. And if such a thing needs to be grounded, which I'm not convinced it does, but we can just say that it's grounded in God's knowledge because he knows what would have been the case had he made the world differently.
Yeah, okay. And so that's where you're getting a little into like grounding objection territory, which is not quite where this is, because we're and it's my bad for using the grounding language. What I'm talking about here is just an ontology for possible worlds for grounding for those truths. We're not talking about the actual truths that reflect, because the context of what I'm talking about here, it seems like you as a Molinist would have to say there is no possible world that God could have, because I'm trying to keep it limited to humans, but even if you want to say there's no possible world that God could have instantiated where you freely choose the red over the orange. And if you want to say that in that exact situation that you would only choose the orange, then it seems weird for the humans' ontology of possible worlds to say like, well, it seems like you freely could have chosen the orange or the red. It seems like that's the case. And so, like I said, I'm just not sure. I don't think that's as big of a problem.
And to me, I just don't see any reason to think that there has to be some ontology to our just epistemic curiosity about what could have been.
Yeah, and that's where I needed to. I listened to his lecture once. I highly recommend his lecture. Let me see if I can find it real quick so I can recommend it to the peoples. It was something that he did at the album Plantinga conference that Trent Doherty set up, and those are two of my favorite philosophers, Trent and Plantinga. Let me see if I can find it. But yeah, it's an excellent lecture. I think it's a really good argument. I haven't really heard much about it before, but I thought it was quite good. So it's there it is. It's Baylor ISR Brian Lefdow, the Plantinga workshop from November 7th, 2014. And so but yeah, it's a really interesting lecture. It's quite fascinating. It's sort of like the argument for math. It's a bit more of an esoteric concept or something like that, but it's quite interesting, I think. But yeah, unless people in the chat have questions or whatever you want to do, like, I'm good. I think that's the main stuff that I have.
Okay, I think that was great. I guess maybe one last thing, and I'll just open it up to if there's anybody still hanging out in the chat. It's getting kind of late, so maybe not. But if they have questions, go ahead and ask them. We won't stay on too much longer. But I guess if you're saying you're not a Calvinist and you have these problems with Molinism, I know you said you're kind of close to the simple foreknowledge. Would you say you do take a view, or you're still undecided but kind of lean towards the simple foreknowledge view?
Right now, I'm kind of undecided. I'm looking into open theism, and that will kill Daniel. But because I'm at least looking into biblical arguments for it. and that's really where it comes for me. You know, these are soteriological, theological views. So it'll come down to biblical things and then what I think of the philosophies surrounding them. And so I would, despite my objections that I had, as I mentioned, I would think that if we're qualifying something as an Arminian view or as a free will inclusive view, I think Molinism is in that category. And so for me, it's like saying, well, it's pretty simple if Calvinism's true. There's some pretty simple ontologies and concepts and stuff surrounding that. But if Arminianism or some sort of free will soteriology is true, then I'm kind of like, well, I'm probably leaning towards open theism or simple foreknowledge if it turns out that the Arminian soteriology is something that I find to be biblical. So that's my leniency right now. So
okay, and that's fine. There might not be too much to say to that. We could do another episode on that because I would have my gripes with open theism.
For me, I think a lot of this stuff, and this is just my opinion, but I think that there's a fair amount of biblical support. I don't know if it's enough. I'm trying to decide if it's enough right now, but I think there's a fair amount of biblical support at least. And you know, in Bayesian terms, there's some evidence for it.
Sure.
But when I look at it on the surface, it looks really great, and then I get into some of the entailments, and that's where it gets sketchy for me. I'm just like, I don't think I can buy that. But I think that, and that's what I'm thinking when I'm looking into simple foreknowledge. I think that there are actually a lot of things philosophically that I think are true about open theism, that on a simple foreknowledge view, you can actually appropriate those things without the negative entailments of open theism. But I'm still working through that because I think there's some really clear ontologies and explanations for what it looks like for God to create the world on Molinism and on open theism and on Calvinism. But just because it's just kind of a more obscure and less well-known view, there's not as many great things like that for simple foreknowledge. So that's where I'm kind of looking into that.
Yeah, I'd check Tim Stratton's website again, freethinkingministries.com, just because I was reading one thing on open theism. It wasn't like super exhaustive, but he might have other stuff where he gets into it more. I mean, I'm not convinced it's logically possible when we consider what omniscience would entail. I don't think it's logically possible. And then also, I think I would have a similar problem that I do with Calvinism, which I think once you accept it, you aren't able to use certain, say, defenses against the problem of evil. You don't get certain like soul-building theodicies of free will defenses. I think some of those things.
Well, you do get a free will defense on open theism.
You do get a free will defense, but not, I wouldn't say certain, because there. To me, I even as Moses, I don't think the free will defense alone answers. I think you need other things, and those other things I think are what goes out the window with open theism. And again, when you say there are certain biblical passages, and that counts as some evidence. Again, I agree, and this is where I agree with Tim Stratton, is Calvinism can make sense of some passages of scripture, but not all, and open theism can make sense of some scriptures, but I just think not all. I think Molinism is the only one that kind of across the board is able to make sense of.
All right, so how do you think that Molinism could make sense of open theism passages?
Because I think once you understand those are written from an anthropomorphic perspective, then that doesn't contradict Molinism. Yeah. So, but then on the other hand, the open theism would have to contend with certain patches, that are a prophecy, and God is predicting the future, and then it comes to pass. So I don't know how I'd contend with those.
The open theist would say that God has decreed those things to be. So I think the thing is, I think the Calvinist would looking at the two I'll call these the two power properties of God, right? You have omniscience and omnipotence. And so the Calvinist and the Molinist would hyper focus on the really, really great extent of God's omniscience. And then the open theist says, I think there are philosophical and or biblical problems with that. And so I'm going to hyper focus on, and I probably would do this a little, not as much as the open theist, but I probably would do this as a simple foreknowledge person to say, well, we're going to more focus on God's omnipotence, because God is sovereign. I think it's Braxton Hunter who talks about this. He's like, there's nothing special about God's sovereignty in the sense that it's categorically different from when a normal king has sovereignty. It's just that God is the most ultimate sovereign of anyone that is ever sovereign over anything. And so if I were an open theist, I would hyper focus, I think, on the omnipotence part and say, well, God decreed that to be. He brought about the events in temporal time to make sure that that happened. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's possible. And then I'm sorry, I was getting distracted by some of the comments. So
you're good. You're good. Me too. It happens.
No, it's okay, and it's getting kind of late. But then, of course, then there's a big question about revelations. I mean, of course, there are preterists, but I mean, I think across the board, most people would recognize that at least there's the second coming of Jesus. Well, I guess you could just say that that's going to be a deliberate thing by God, so it doesn't have to really be God can know what He's going to do. So I guess you might say that doesn't count. But I was as someone who takes a futurist view of revelation, I would say, being that that's things that haven't occurred yet. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say in time, anything God predicts will finally, but then there are certain things that say, hold on, let me find this. Oh, maybe I don't have it. Never mind.
You're good.
Yeah, I mean, there are verses. Hold on, let me find it, because I'm one of those people who I know what the verses say, but like I don't know the chapter and verse.
Yeah, I'm exactly that way too. I want to be one of those guys that's just like chapter blah blah blah, this book of this verse and blah, but no.
Yeah, I mean, and granted, of course, depending on yeah, Isaiah 46:10, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand. I will do all things I please. I mean, to me, though, that seems like a backdoor way out if the open theist is simply just saying, well, God just in real time decrees it. But then I think there's still certain losses that you have to take with regards to the answering problem.
Yeah,
people.
absolutely. I think there are some. I think there are the one really strong advantage. I think a lot of people think that you get a free way out of the problem of evil with open theism, which I think is really false. But I think the best advantage that the open theist has is they can actually avoid problems of divine creation, which I think are one of the bigger problems with like theism when you're talking about coherency of theism, as to, you know, that's like Leibniz, where he concluded there's only one possible world that God could have made and stuff like that. And so, but if you're an open theist, then there's just God can't have, or God, just lost my train of thought. God's not actualizing a world that's the best possible world because it's contingent in a lot of regards. So, or contingent on certain truths.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say another point is when we talk about God allowing evil for overall goods, you know, the point is if they're going to explain those verses where God predicts the future by saying, well, God just makes this plan to intervene at good times, then you also have to explain why He doesn't intervene at other times when like extraordinarily terrible evils are occurring. Like,
yeah,
like I think Molinism can answer the question, why does God allow something? Even if we don't know the specific reason, we know general reasons, but I think open theism, you lose access to all that. It's like, I think you just give the atheist too much ground. And real quick, I did want to quote this from Tim Stratton's article, where he says that, I think he used this as it's in a different context, but I think you can use it as an objection to open theism, where he says, consider Psalm 73, verses 11 through 12. And they say, how can God know? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Behold, these are the wicked. So,
okay. So I have big problems. I was reading that verse earlier. I have big problems with this exegesis there, but because in that psalm he's talking about those people are wicked people who are talking about how can God know like the actions that I committed that were sinful against Him, and so you can pull it from there. That would be what I would call a weak proof text in that regard. But you know, I guess in principle I agree. But you know.
No, fair
let's
enough.
just say I love Tim Stratton dearly with all of my heart, but I was not very impressed by the articles that he had on Molinism. I love his free will stuff, his free thinking argument, fantastic, except for premise 8. But other than that, like, it was great.
Premise 8.
Oh, he just kind of goes abductively to God, but I'm not a bit. I want to talk with him about it because I have.
Okay.
But he hasn't responded to me on Facebook Messenger. So Tim, if you see this, I have a Facebook Messenger that I sent you.
Too.
Yes, because I want to talk with him about it. I actually want to hear his case for it. So.
Okay, cool. Well, that makes 2.5 hours. So, listen, thank you so much for coming on. This has been very, to me, in my opinion, very fruitful and interesting. I think I've definitely gotten a lot out of it. I hope the audience has as well. Are there any thoughts you would like to leave the audience with?
Not much. You know, I'm certainly still open to this view. I certainly have, as I've shown, some philosophical issues with it, but I certainly appreciate this. And as Matthew said, these are things that are certainly beyond human understanding. And I think that was one interesting thing that I remember listening to William Lane Craig talking about this, where he was talking about, I think it was one of his defenders classes, about, well, why don't we just, someone asked him, like, why don't we just punt this to mystery? Why don't we just say that? And he's like, well, that may be a possibility in the future, but right now we just need to try the best that we can to see if we can actually understand how God works this. And so I think that's just what we're doing. And I think that that's a good thing. God gave us brains and minds to think these things through. And I think that's a valuable pursuit. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm going to pull this one question up because it is like 4:30 in the morning for him. So him being there. And I think you answered this. So how could God assure that prophecy comes to pass on open theism? I did want to feature this question there.
Yeah, and so I'm sure the open theists would just say that God, well, for one thing, they would say that God has what I was talking about, of the high probabilistic knowledge of what people will do. So he knows people well enough to give it a really, really good guess of what they're going to do. And if there's certain things that he decrees, certain aspects of history that are really important to his plan that he wants to happen, then he's just going to ensure that's going to happen. Now, I think there are a few problems to that, but I think that's a plausible answer from the open theist. So.
Right on. And I did want to address this one from that he put at the very beginning. Would love to hear at least some biblical passages from each of you that I believe supports your position of either Molinism or not Molinism and full exegesis. So yeah, I did not give a full exegesis at all, but I did reference this article from Tim Stratton, Molinism is biblical. And I obviously won't read the whole thing right here. But basically he does go into verses that support the idea that humans possess libertarian free will, then ones that say God possesses counterfactual knowledge, and then verses that show that God loves and desires the best for all people, and then draws his conclusion as the cumulative case there. So yeah, I would highly recommend people go check out, and I'll put links to those articles in the description. So yeah, and definitely a link also to Plantinga's Bulldog. The YouTube channel is in the description. Please, guys, go.
We'll have videos one day.
Yeah, go subscribe there. Obviously, if you want to support the Unapologetic Apologist, you can go to subscribestar.com/TUA. You sign up there, you'll automatically be entered into the book giveaway. There's all kinds of different goodies there, exclusive access to web extended interviews. I'm sorry, I'm getting tired. Web extended interviews that are not found for public access on YouTube, and all kinds of other things. So,
and yeah, that terrible tasting mug, right? That's yours, right?
I
remember that commercial that you did.
That you know what's funny is did he send that to you privately? Because I didn't think I aired that. I've been planning to, but I haven't done it yet. Unless I did and just am completely unaware of it. But anyway, sorry. Mr. Kyle, sir, Plantinga's Bulldog, thank you so much for being here, brother, and we'll get you back on soon.
Yeah, man, it's been a pleasure, and you're always a pleasure to hang around, so it's good to be here.
Thanks, man. God bless.
Take care.